Hey, guys. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Dawn arrives with all the subtlety of a polite knock. No roosters, no fanfare. Just the faint glow through rice paper doors, and the soft shuffle of servants pretending they aren't judging your futon posture. You lie perfectly still, not because you're rested, but because any abrupt movement might undo your status as graceful and mysterious. In truth, your back hurts, your hair is flattened on one side, and you've had a dream involving eels you'd rather not analyze. But none of that matters now. This is the first scene of the day's performance. You are the star and also the stage decoration. Your attendants enter in hushed tones, bowing so low you briefly consider stepping over them. A warm basin is set before you, as if to say here is your dignity. Now scrub behind your ears. They begin their work, cleansing, brushing, preparing you to look less like someone who just woke up and more like a porcelain enigma. Your face is washed gently, your hair brushed with reverence, not because they love you, but because they've seen what happens to court women who show up with frizz. Meanwhile, you maintain the correct expression. Serene, detached, and only mildly annoyed. Still silent because heaven forbid a concubine speak before being powdered. You glance at your reflection in a polished bronze mirror. You look like someone who has opinions but is paid not to share them. Perfect. From beyond the sliding screen comes the muffled laughter of the daimyo, who apparently has energy this morning. That's either a promising sign or a warning. You make a mental note to avoid direct eye contact with his favorite concubine until after tea. You rise from the futon like a swan emerging from fog, assuming the swan has slightly numb legs and a tight obi waiting in her near future. Your sleeves are laid out. The incense is lit. The illusion begins. And as you stretch your shoulders just slightly, you whisper the universal mantra of women everywhere. Here we go again. Now that you're upright and pretending you didn't sleep on your neck wrong, it's time for makeup. Or, as it's known in the concubine industry, historical self-erasure with a side of toxins. Step 1, the white powder made from crushed rice, and in some cases enough lead to qualify as a building material. Your attendant starts patting it onto your face like she's trying to cover up a crime scene. The goal? Eliminate all signs of life. If your skin tone resembles anything found in nature, you're doing it wrong. Next comes the neck and chest, because, heaven forbid, the daimyo glimpses a patch of skin that doesn't look like it was painted on by a ghost. You sit still while they go to town with a puff, occasionally resisting the urge to sneeze and ruin your new identity. Then the eyebrows. Yours. Irrelevant. They're painted over and redrawn several centimeters too high, creating a look that says I'm surprised by everything and emotionally unavailable. It's considered alluring in theory. Now the lips. You think they'd be fully painted, but no, just a dainty little red blob in the middle. It's supposed to look demure. Instead, it looks like you kissed a plum and ran away. But you nod approvingly anyway, because this is how tradition works. If it feels strange and mildly unflattering, you're probably doing it right. And finally, the piece de resistance. Teeth blackening. Yes, really. A sticky iron paste is carefully brushed onto your teeth, making your smile look like it's been censored. Supposedly, this signals that you're off limits. In practice, it only confuses people and gives you one more reason not to grin too often throughout this whole ordeal. You sit like a statue being vandalized by a very polite team of artists. You do not move. You do not comment. You certainly do not ask. Is this really necessary? The answer is always yes. Not because it makes sense, but because it's been done this way for centuries and no one wants to be the first to blink. By the end, you look like a painting come to life if the painting was done by someone who hated skin and liked drama. After being powdered into an emotionally distant kabuki mask, it's time to get dressed. And by dressed, we don't mean slipping into something comfortable. We mean willingly entering a fabric-based endurance challenge. Step 1, under layers. These are the breathable cotton pieces meant to stop your fancier garments from fusing with your soul during summer. They do not succeed, but at least they give you the illusion of ventilation. Next come the inner robes. Decorative, symbolic, and entirely unnecessary, except that they're absolutely required. Each one must be put on in the right order, or your social status drops faster than a clumsy geisha on ice. Color combinations? Entirely coded. For example, dark red over pale green means elegant but mysterious, while white over gold says, please don't talk to me before tea. Then there's the outer kimono. Heavier, shinier, much less forgiving. By now, your sleeves are long enough to smother a rival concubine if needed, which, incidentally, is why no one stands too close during morning prep. And finally, the obi, the sash that ties it all together and quietly tries to murder your spine. It's pulled tight enough to remind you you're not allowed to breathe freely until sunset. A well-tied obi can say many things. Refinement, poise, and the quiet desperation of someone once sneezed away from full collapse. You don't dress yourself, of course. You stand still while two attendants wrap, fold, tug, and adjust you like they're trying to make origami out of a human being. They don't speak. They just occasionally grunt when something doesn't lie flat. That grunt means hold your arms higher. You learn the language. By the time they're done, you've lost all feeling in your ribs. But you look magnificent, like a walking imperial scroll with passive-aggressive eyes. And the real kicker, this is your daily outfit. You don't even have plans. You might just sit in the garden pretending to read poetry all day, but you must look like you're ready for a royal portrait or a spontaneous seduction. Which, to be fair, is not off the table. You're fully dressed now, which is impressive considering you're wearing more fabric than a small pavilion tent. Time for breakfast, or as it's known in concubine circles, an exercise in restraint, posture, and not accidentally dipping your sleeve in the miso. You're seated on a cushion, legs tucked properly beneath you, which is charming if you're a folding fan, but a nightmare if you have knees. A tray is placed in front of you. Precisely arranged a bowl of rice, a sliver of grilled fish, 3 pickled vegetables, and a miso soup that looks like it's judging you. The portions are small because you are not here to bulk up. You are here to appear ethereal and faintly underfed, the way all good romantic metaphors do. Your job is to consume just enough to avoid collapsing, but not enough to imply you enjoy food. If you chew too enthusiastically, someone will raise an eyebrow. If you ask for seconds, someone will raise a scroll. Eating is done silently. No slurping, no sighing, and definitely no face contortions. Even if the pickled plum just sucker punch your molars, everything must be graceful. A ballet of chopsticks and disappointment. Your kimono sleeves are enormous, so each bite involves a level of spatial awareness, usually reserved for swordplay. You develop techniques. Tuck the sleeve under your forearm. Lean slightly sideways. Pray it doesn't drag through the soup and send a wave of fermented tofu across the tatami. All the while, attendants hover quietly. They won't say anything, but they're watching. Not in a creepy way, more in the way we'll gossip about this later. Every blink is noted. Every missed grain of rice is mentally catalogued under mild embarrassment. You finish, bow lightly, and set your chopsticks down with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. Breakfast complete. Was it satisfying? Emotionally, no. Nutritionally questionable. But spiritually, you feel lighter. That could be the food or the fact that your OB is slowly cutting off circulation to your spine. Either way, you're ready for the next part of your day, which, spoiler alert, mostly involves waiting now that you've been powdered. Robbed and fed something roughly the size of a toddler's snack, it's time for the concubine's primary daily task. Waiting. But not just any waiting. Elegant waiting. Waiting for whispers. Yes, I'm entirely free this afternoon, but in a powerful way. You can't roam the estate freely. Heavens no. That's how scandals happen. Instead, you sit in your designated space. A tastefully minimal garden room with a painted screen, bonsai tree, and a strategically placed view of a koi pond that hasn't done anything interesting since last autumn. You sit, you wait. Occasionally you adjust your posture so it looks like you're contemplating eternity, not fighting off a leg cramp. You're not allowed to look impatient. That's for merchants and wives. Concubines wait like they're doing you a favor. This wait could last 10 minutes, or 5 hours. The daimyo may summon you or not. He might be with another woman, or reading war poetry, or just napping with his head on a very expensive pillow. The point is, you'll find out when someone tells you or doesn't. To pass the time, you might compose a poem. Not a good one, just something vaguely sad about plum blossoms and unspoken longing. That's the genre. Bonus points if no one can tell who it's actually about. You could also play a shamisen softly, not too joyfully. No one likes a concubine who seems excited. Of course, the other women are waiting too, sometimes within sight, sometimes just out of earshot. It's a silent competition. Who looks most serene? Who adjusted her robe just right? Who caught the eye of the messenger, delivering tea to the daimyo's quarters? It's chess played with glances posture, and whether or not your oboba is tied fashionably off-center. And the trickiest part, looking like you're not waiting at all. You must appear as though your entire sense of self-worth doesn't hang on the possibility of being summoned tonight, which of course it absolutely does. But you're a professional. You sigh quietly, beautifully, and look off into the distance, preferably towards something poetic, like a falling leaf, or a koi that looks equally bored. If the morning was about preparation, the afternoon is about positioning, and we're not talking about yoga. This is a courtly social strategy, dressed in floral silk and scented with plum blossom oil. By now, the other concubines are fully assembled. You exchange nods, shallow bows, and smiles that look warm but could cut glass. This isn't friendship. It's centered around espionage. Everyone's watching, listening, and very quietly trying to destroy each other's reputations without ever raising their voices. The room is calm. The tension is floral. The topics of conversation are trivial by design. Lady Aiko's calligraphy has improved. Translation. She used to write like a drunken monk. The daimyo seemed very peaceful this morning. Translation. He didn't summon you, did he? And of course, the classic. You look radiant today, which actually means you look less dead than usual. Congratulations. Compliments are verbal daggers sheathed in politeness. The sharper the smile, the more likely you're being insulted. A well-timed observation about someone's kimono being bravely modern can spark a week-long existential crisis. You navigate all of this with grace, or at least you pretend to. Smile gently. Tilt your head when listening. Appear impressed by someone's haiku, even though it was clearly plagiarized from a folding screen. Then comes the moment someone mentions the daimyo. Maybe he was seen walking near the pond. Maybe he paused to examine a fan one of the other concubines left out by accident. The room becomes still, but casually still, like no one's definitely panicking on the inside. This is when the performance deepens. You must seem interested in him, but not too interested. Confident, but not cocky. Available, but untouched. It's like trying to be a dessert that everyone wants, but no one sure is safe to eat. And through it all, you keep your voice soft, your posture impeccable, and your insults indirect. This is how status is gained. Not through war, through whispers. And if you leave the room with even one rival doubting her sleeve choice, her poem, or her scent, you've done well today. You haven't been summoned yet, but hope springs eternal and also sweats discreetly under 12 layers of silk. So as the sun crawls past its highest point and you survive another round of eye contact diplomacy, it's time for your just-in-case bath. Not mandatory, just highly recommended. In the same way, it's recommended you don't smell like anxiety and pickled radish when entering a daimyo's private chamber. The bathhouse is quiet, steamy, and filled with the faint scent of yuzu peels and pressure. You undress with your attendant's help, because most concubines cannot single-handedly escape the labyrinth of ties, folds, knots, and moral restrictions that come with formal kimono wear. Once disrobed, finally free of the human upholstery, you step into the hot water. For a brief moment, you are no one, not a symbol, not a strategy. Just a sweaty woman in a tub, wondering if she shaved her legs evenly enough for an aristocrat with questionable eyesight. You scrub, but not aggressively. There's a technique to this. You want to be clean, not desperate. A light scent is applied. Nothing too floral. You're not trying to smell like a geisha with something to prove. just alluring enough to imply you own your own fan. Hair is reoiled, skin is dusted, feet are checked for calluses. Because, yes, even your heels must be ready for inspection by men who haven't clipped their toenails since the last rice harvest. And all this might be for nothing. You may not be called. You may go back to your quarters and reapply all your powder just to sit perfectly still while composing emotionally vague poetry about ducks. But if he does summon you, and you show up smelling like stress and raw tofu, scandalous, so you bathe, you prepare. You become soft and subtle and ever so mildly flammable with incense oil, because being ready is part of the game, even if the invitation never arrives. And besides, the best revenge on the other concubines looking better than they do while not even trying. It doesn't happen with trumpets. There's no scroll unrolled by a herald, no dramatic gong. The summons, when it finally comes, arrives the way most terrifying things do in high society. Politely. A soft knock, a bowed messenger. A single phrase. His lordship requests your presence. Translation. You've been chosen. Also, you have 20 minutes to mentally prepare, repowder, and spiritually detach. Your attendants spring into action. You, meanwhile, attempt to look neither smug nor nauseous after all. This is a compliment. Possibly. It could mean he favors you, or it could mean his favorite is annoyed with him, and you're the understudy. Either way, tonight you're on stage. First comes reapplication, a fresh layer of powder to mask the existential dread, a tiny touch of rouge to stay alive but mysterious, and a careful adjustment of your outer kimono. You switch to the more expensive one. The one with cranes embroidered in flight, because nothing says I'm worth undressing slowly like symbolic birds in gold thread. Next, the hair. Already perfect, but you go over it again, just in case. You add a comb, not too flashy, and dab a little extra yuzu oil behind the ears. You smell like restraint and citrus ambition. As you walk toward his private chambers, the hallway stretches endlessly. Every step is measured. Not too fast, not too eager. You are a river, not a waterfall. Behind closed doors, rival concubines pretend not to notice. But they do. Oh, they do. You reach the inner room. A screen is slid open. You bow deeply, elegantly. You're not nervous, just incredibly aware of every inch of your body and whether or not your lips are smudged. He greets you or doesn't. Either way, you smile faintly. You're now in character. A favorite. Diversion. A muse for the evening. No one says. That's not how this works. You are here because you were chosen, and for the next few hours you must be art, warmth, mystery, and convenience. And maybe, just maybe, unforgettable. But let's not get cocky yet. There's still tea to pour, despite what the gossiping laundresses might say. A concubine's evening with a daimyo doesn't start with disrobing. It starts with ritual. Specifically, a slow, fragrant descent into flirtation, so formal it might be mistaken for a tea ceremony with unresolved tension. You sit, not too close, not yet. There's a lacquered table between you, a pot of sake warming silently, and enough eye contact to fuel an entire haiku anthology. He pours you a cup. That's the cue. You sip it slowly, like it's not just fermented rice, but a coded invitation to be charming. Compliments begin both ways. His robe? Magnificent. Your hair? Exquisite. No one mentions that you both know exactly how this night ends, but it's part of the charm to pretend otherwise. Conversation drifts. Poetry, dreams, sometimes a story about a hawk he once saw. It looked like destiny. You nod, intrigued. And not just because his hand is inching closer. You've heard the hawk's story 3 times, but that's not the point. The point is tonight. You're the muse. Even if you're also a well-trained performer, there might be music, maybe a soft melody on the shamisen. Not played by you, of course. You're busy holding the room's attention like a delicate fan, open, mysterious, and possibly sharp-edged. Now comes the touch. Light at first, a hand brushing yours, a compliment about your scent, carefully phrased to imply admiration, not obsession. If he's in a poetic mood, he might compare you to a plum blossom caught in snow. If he's tired, you might look nice tonight. Either way, you smile and bow your head like he just recited love from Mount Fuji itself. Eventually, the formality fades. The table is moved, the lights dim, the screen doors close, and your eyes slowly, of course, to follow him into the adjoining chamber. This is not transactional. This is theater. And your role, to be everything it wants. Desirable, graceful, compliant, and memorably alluring, without ever seeming like you were trying. No pressure. You just have to seduce a warlord using 3 centuries of etiquette and a strategically timed glance. Let's be clear, this isn't romance. This is a government-approved performance featuring 2 leads, 0 dialogue, and a strong supporting cast of expectations. You enter the chamber like moonlighting, incarnate, or at least that's the goal. You kneel, bow, smile. You do not trip. That was last month. You've trained for this. Literally. Months of lessons on posture, touch, breath control, and facial expressions that say, yes, I'm enjoying this, without ever crossing into anything as vulgar as honesty. The futon is simple. The bedding is clean. The air is scented with incense that promises serenity, though what it really offers is a faint tickle in your nostrils and the urgent need not to sneeze. He begins the ritual with touch, soft at first, measured. He's testing the waters, or perhaps reminding himself which concubine you are. You respond accordingly, just enough to signal interest, never so much as to appear enthusiastic. Remember, mystery is sexy. Desperation is not. There's no conversation. That ended with a poetry. This is about presence. You're both in character now. He, the powerful lord. You, the willing flower who conveniently just bloomed tonight. You move the way you were taught, gracefully, precisely, as if choreographed by someone who's never actually been in love, but read a lot of poetry about it. You make all the right sounds at all the right times. Not too loud, not too silent. Just enough to let him know he's doing well. Even if you're mentally reorganizing your poetry scrolls, eventually it ends either in triumph or in what you will later refer to as a gentle fade out. He may say something, he may not. You smile either way. Your eyes redress and bow, carefully hiding the pins that left indentations in your scalp and the cramp that started somewhere in Act 2. And then you leave. You do not look back. You do not ask how it was. You do not ask if he remembers your name, because this was not for connection. This was for position. And tonight you had it for now. He's asleep, sprawled out across the futon like a man who's just conquered a province, and not, say, fallen asleep immediately after moderate effort. You lie beside him, eyes open. Spine straight, mind racing. Not because you're overwhelmed with emotion, but because this part, the afterglow, is where the real mental gymnastics begin. Did you do well? Was your hair still in place? Did he like the part where you tilted your head just so? Should you have moaned a bit more, or was that one breath too loud? These are the questions you won't ask, but will obsessively review like a general analyzing battlefield losses. You can't move yet. Leaving too soon seems cold. Staying too long seems clingy. So you lie there, watching the ceiling, counting the bamboo slats, and wondering if the other concubines are awake. Probably they can smell a summoning like wolves smell fear. The silence is heavy, not unpleasant, just full. Full of unsaid things, unasked questions, and the faint hope that you've earned yourself a slightly better breakfast tray tomorrow. He might mumble something. A compliment, a name hopefully yours. You nod in the dark, even if he's already snoring like a man who's never had to sleep with his dignity folded inside his obi. Eventually, you rise quietly. The graceful post-coital exit is a delicate thing. You gather your robe, tie your sash, and straighten your hair just enough to look like a woman who glows from mystery, not sweat. There's no one in the corridor, but you walk like they're all watching, because in this place they always are. Your footsteps are soft. Your face is neutral, your heart tucked away, locked up behind your very best performance. Yet you return to your quarters. Someone has already lit the lamp. The tea is warm. You drink it without tasting it. You sit down alone, and only then do you exhale. You don't know if tonight meant anything. You don't know if he'll remember it or you tomorrow. But at the very least, you know this. You were chosen. And in this world, that is currency. Even if it only lasts until sunrise, you wake up early again. Not because you're refreshed, but because concubines don't get to sleep in. That's for wives or men, or mythical creatures with no political rivals. The futon you fell into last night feels smaller. Or maybe you're just aware of how little space you actually occupy in the palace's hierarchy. A decorative presence wrapped in brocade and tightly controlled expectations. Your attendants enter, as politely avoiding yours. No one says anything about where you were last night, but they all know the scent of incense lingers faintly on your skin. And your hair is only slightly messier than the standard unapproachable cloud of perfection look. They begin the process anew. Powder, comb, fold, reconstruct the masterpiece that is your public face, which is remarkably similar to yesterday's masterpiece, with the only real difference being your increased awareness of how exhausting beauty actually is. The silence between you and your attendants is companionable, if also tinged with quiet judgment. One might cough ever so lightly. Another might casually mention that Lady Keiko received a rare silk comb this morning. You know it. The game is back on. There's no debrief, no recap. You don't tell anyone how the daimyo smelled faintly of plum wine, or how he said something vaguely poetic before falling asleep mid-sentence. You certainly don't mention that you're now second-guessing every moment of eye contact. That would be unseemly. Instead, you sit once again in your chamber, composed, refined, preparing for another day of passive warfare disguised as floral arrangement critiques and shamisen practice. You sip tea. You write half a poem. You stare at a crane outside the window and wonder what it feels like to fly away from all of this while wearing only one layer of clothing. By now, news will have traveled. Everyone knows you were summoned. Everyone is recalculating, including you, because that's what being a concubine really means. Balancing emotion with calculation, intimacy with strategy, and desire with absolute silence. You smooth your sleeve, you breathe. Today, you're not the favorite, but you are still in the game. And in this palace, survival looks an awful lot like stillness and silk. You don't need ears to hear gossip in a palace. You just need functioning intuition and a decent understanding of passive-aggressive phrasing. Within an hour of sunrise, your name has floated through at least 3 courtyards, 2 tea rooms, and a suspiciously loud flower arranging session. No one says it directly, of course. They say things like how radiant Lady so-and-so seems this morning, which means she's glowing because she got chosen and we're all pretending not to notice. I wonder if his lordship prefers traditional poetry or livelier company these days. Translation. She probably recited something dumb and still got picked. Unbelievable. You hear these things in passing, snippets whispered behind fans or dropped into casual conversations like little poison seeds. It's impressive in a way, like watching trained assassins throw shade with floral metaphors. Your job? Stay quiet. Say nothing. Smile faintly the way a cat does when it knows something you don't. Because engaging in gossip is risky, but being the target of gossip and reacting fatal. So instead, you vanish a little. You take longer walks. You sit slightly further from the group. You practice your calligraphy with such focus that people begin to wonder if you're either deeply enlightened or quietly scheming. Either way. Good, because in the concubine arena, invisibility is a superpower. The loud ones get noticed. The noticed ones get envied. And envy here is basically a decorative dagger in a silk sheath. You respond to barbed compliments with kindness, so polite it's insulting. Oh, you think my robe is too elaborate? Thank you. It was a gift. Smile. Oh, exit the scene. You survive on restraint, timing, and the occasional knowing glance that suggests you could destroy someone if you cared enough. And while others scramble for proximity to power, you perfect the art of subtle distance. You don't need to always be in the spotlight because you are already in it once. It starts subtly. Fewer glances, slower summons. One day the maid forgets your favorite incense. Another, your tea arrives lukewarm. The message is clear. Not harsh, not cruel, just indifferent. You are no longer tonight's mystery. Someone else's. She's new or not. Maybe she's just had a glow up and a conveniently timed poem. Either way, she's suddenly the focus. The fan of attention has turned, and it's not pointing at you. You handle it like a professional. No complaints, no dramatics. Just a slightly longer pause before bowing to the daimyo and an almost imperceptible tightness in your smile. When someone says, "Isn't it lovely how youthful Lady Hannah looks these days?" Of course it is. Youth is so charming, so temporary. Now comes the test. Can you stay poised while being quietly replaced? Can you fold your hands and compliment your successor's hairpin while mentally calculating how long she'll last before she trips over her own ambition? This is the unspoken part of the job. Not just being chosen, but being unchosen gracefully. The fall from favor is not a scandal, just a shift in the tide. You're still in the palace, still dressed like a painting, still performing. But the spotlight has moved, and now you have to survive in the shadows without looking like you care. You still show up to the garden, still compose poems, still sit perfectly still during afternoon tea while everyone tries to read into the way your cup trembles. But the truth is you do care. Of course you do. Not just for him, but for the position, the validation, the tiny power that came with being the center of a very controlled universe. And now you are a supporting character in someone else's story, but you're still here, still powdered, still composed, still waiting. Because in a palace like this, everything shifts eventually. Fortunes, fashions, favorites. All it takes is a wrong word, a broken fan, or a poetic metaphor about rain that sounds a little too personal. So you wait. Not bitter, just patient. Because if favor can fade, it can also return, and you'll be ready when it does. Eventually, the paint comes off. Not just the white rice powder you wear like armor, but the performance, the posture, the careful pauses between each word. At some point, whether it's years later or just a moment in solitude, you catch a glimpse of yourself without the costume. And the strange thing is, you're still there, beneath the layers of fabric, reputation, jealousy, poems. In politeness lives a woman who remembers everything. The first summons, the first compliment, the first time she realized she was no longer the favorite. You've played every part. Muse, rival, mystery, shadow. You've smiled through rejection and composed haiku while quietly planning your emotional survival. And we have to show for it. A spine stronger than your obi. A memory sharper than any court gossip. And an entire palace of women who either fear you, envy you, or quietly hope they age half as well as you have. Because here's the secret no one talks about. Concubines age. They fade, but they also endure. And in a world built around staying desirable, endurance is the most rebellious act of all. You no longer rush to the mirror when the messenger arrives. You no longer wonder if your hair is pinned at the right angle for seduction. Some days you skip the full makeup ritual and just sit by the koi pond, because sometimes watching fish do nothing feels more honest than trying to look like a poem. You still dress in silk, yes, but now you wear it for yourself. And when the new girls arrive, powdered, bright-eyed, walking the same hallway you once conquered, you smile. Not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly, because you played the game. You danced on the edge of power with your lips painted and your voice lowered to a whisper. And you're still here, still graceful, still dangerous in silence. What remains when the paint wears off? You do. And that's more than anyone ever expected. In ancient Babylon, the line between the sacred and the sensual wasn't just blurred, it was obliterated. The heart of this mystery lay in the towering temples of Ishtar, goddess of love, fertility, and war. Unlike the prudish morality that came centuries later, the Babylonians saw sexuality as a divine bridge, a way to reach the gods, not offend them. Within these temples, ritual sex wasn't just accepted, it was expected, and it wasn't done in shadowy corners, but in full view of heaven, according to ancient sources. Particularly Herodotus, that tireless gossip of the classical world. Every Babylonian woman, at least once in her life, was required to present herself at the temple of Ishtar. There she would wait, adorned in perfume and prayer, until a stranger approached her and tossed a silver coin into her lap, the goddess's prize. No woman could refuse. The act itself, sex with a man she didn't know, was not seen as scandalous, but sacred, a public sacrifice of her body for the good of the cosmos. The temple was not a brothel, not in the way we understand it. It was more like a stage where religion and desire played out rituals older than kings, and the women who served there, the Nadtu, weren't lowly. Many were priestesses or daughters of nobility, cloaked in silks and mystery. Their duties were spiritual, ecstatic, and yes, sexual. The idea was simple and utterly radical. By engaging in sex under the gaze of the gods, fertility was invoked. Divine favor was won, and cosmic order was maintained. The land would bear crops, the rivers would flow, wombs would swell. It wasn't sin, it was sacred ecology. But let's not romanticize it entirely. Even in antiquity, not everyone agreed with this so-called sacred sex. Later Mesopotamian rulers would try to distance themselves from the practice, perhaps out of moral reform or political pressure. But for a brief golden window in Babylon's history, the body was not a vessel of shame. It was the altar, and the whispering walls of Ishtar's temple still echo with those long-forgotten moans of worship. If Babylon turned sex into sacred duty, the ancient Greeks turned it into theater, one with masks, wine, and secrets. At the center of this was Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and revelry. And nothing captured his spirit quite like the Dionysian mysteries, private initiation rites where participants sought to dissolve the boundaries between human and divine. These weren't your typical temple visits. The mysteries were held deep in groves or hidden sanctuaries, away from the public eye. Only the initiated could enter, and what happened inside was closely guarded. Outsiders speculated about wild orgies and drunken chaos, but the truth, as always, is more complex. Participants, men and women alike, prepared through fasting, music, dance, and long processions. They wore masks, animal skins, and sometimes nothing at all. The point was to shed your social identity, your ego, even your name. For a few hours, you weren't a merchant, a servant, or a noble. You were part of something primal, something older than the city walls. Sexual energy likely played a role, not as entertainment, but as a symbol of rebirth and unity. In a society where most of life was highly structured, these rites allowed for a controlled collapse of order. They promised catharsis, a temporary breakdown of barriers between man and woman, rich and poor, mortal and God. But it wasn't just a wild night in the woods. The mysteries were said to offer deep transformation. Those who returned claimed to have touched the divine, to have glimpsed something beyond reason. And indeed, many initiates described a feeling of renewal, as if the chaos had burned away their illusions. Of course, not everyone approved. Philosophers like Plato distrusted these ecstatic rituals, fearing they would lure people away from logic and discipline. But for many Greeks, the Dionysian mysteries were a necessary counterpart to their rigid public lives. They offered something that temples and politics could not convey, and that's the key. These rituals weren't about scandal, they were about transcendence by embracing the wildness within. The Greeks believed they could access something sacred. In ancient Egypt, fertility wasn't just about crops or childbirth. It was the very lifeblood of the kingdom, and no river symbolized that better than the Nile. Each year, its floodwaters would rise, spreading rich silt and life across the land. The Egyptians saw this as a divine act, a sacred union between sky and earth, and they celebrated it with rituals that were anything but subtle. One of the most intriguing festivals was held in honor of the god Min, a deity of fertility, agriculture, and masculine vigor. His statues left little to the imagination. Often shown with an exaggerated permanent sign of virility, Min was not just a symbol of life, but a potency at his annual festival. Crowds would gather to watch the pharaoh himself participate in a ceremonial harvest, cutting the first sheaf of grain as an offering to the god. But this wasn't just a farming event. Dancers would perform nude or scantily clad, celebrating the beauty of the human body and its role in creation. Ritual chants, rhythmic drumming and incense created an atmosphere that blurred the line between spiritual exaltation and sensory pleasure. Women played a key role in many of these ceremonies, especially during the Festival of Drunkenness, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, patron of love, music, and joy. This wild annual celebration involved wine, music, and ecstatic dancing, meant to honor the myth in which Hathor saved the world by drinking herself into a stupor. Participants believed that by reenacting the goddess's drunken joy, they were restoring cosmic balance, bringing chaos into order. Were there sexual undertones? Almost certainly, but they weren't seen as taboo. The Egyptians didn't view sexuality through the lens of guilt or shame. For them, it was part of nature's cycle, as vital and sacred as the flooding Nile. In fact, some healing temples even included rituals where fertility problems were addressed, not just with herbs, but through symbolic acts involving touch, suggestion, or sacred roleplay. Overseen by temple staff who acted as intermediaries between human and divine in ancient Egypt, to embrace pleasure was not indulgence. It was aligned with the gods, and every kiss of the Nile reminded them that life at its core was a sensual gift from the divine. Rome, where even chaos had structure, and nowhere was that more evident than in Lupercalia, the annual fertility festival. Held each February beneath the Palatine Hill, what began as a wild rural rite in honor of shepherd gods morphed into one of the strangest public celebrations in Roman history, one part purification, one part party, and more than a little bit of provocative theater. The ritual honored Lupercus, a god associated with fertility and the protection of livestock, but the origin myth went deeper. The cave of Lupercal was said to be the very spot where Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, were suckled by a she-wolf, and that primal symbolism bled into the celebration itself. At the heart of the festivities were the Luperci, a group of young men chosen to represent wild, untamed energy. Clad in little more than goat skins, or sometimes nothing at all, they would run through the streets, playfully striking women with strips of hide called fabrua. Far from being offended, women actively sought out the lashes. Being struck was believed to enhance fertility, ease childbirth, and even increase sensual vitality. It was messy, loud, and unapologetically earthy. There were sacrifices, feasting, and body songs, but there was also a sense of sacred intention. Lupercalia marked the cleansing of the city, a symbolic brushing away of winter's stagnation to make room for spring's renewal. Sexual overtones were present, sure, but wrapped in layers of myth, nature, and destiny. Later Roman poets, including Ovid, would write about Lupercalia with a mix of humor and nostalgia. And while conservative voices tried to tame the festivities over time, the tradition held strong for centuries until Christianity eventually swept in with a stricter moral lens. Interestingly, some historians suggest that Valentine's Day may have grown from the ashes of Lupercalia, transformed from goatskin rites to paper hearts. But the root idea remained fertility, love, and the strange human urge to ritualize desire. Rome didn't separate the physical from the sacred. It wrapped them around each other like vines on a temple column, sometimes tangled, always connected. And for one wild day each year, the people let their inner wolves run free. If Lupercalia was a public spectacle, the Eleusinian mysteries were its spiritual opposite, secretive, sacred, and solemn. Celebrated annually for over 1,000 years in ancient Greece, these rites revolved around a myth of Demeter and Persephone and offered a powerful glimpse into life, death, and rebirth. But beneath the poetic myth and theatrical silence, some scholars believe the ceremonies may have included symbolic, perhaps even sensual elements cloaked in allegory. Held in the sanctuary of Eleusis, just northwest of Athens, the mysteries drew thousands of participants, from philosophers to farmers. Unlike most Greek religious practices, these rituals weren't exclusive to social status or gender. The only requirement, secrecy. To reveal what happened inside was punishable, sometimes by death. The rites centered on the story of Persephone, the maiden abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Her mother, Demeter, goddess of agriculture, mourned so deeply that the earth itself withered. Their eventual reunion symbolized the return of life in spring and the hope of life after death. What does that have to do with sex? Potentially everything. The myth itself is deeply symbolic. Abduction, descent, reunion, and fertility. Some scholars argue that the secret climax of the Eleusinian Mysteries involve a dramatic reenactment, possibly including a ritualized union between actors playing Persephone and a divine male consort. Whether literal or purely symbolic, the experience was said to be overwhelming emotionally, psychologically, and perhaps physically. Participants fasted, walked in torchlit processions, drank a mysterious potion called Kykeon, and entered the Telesterion, the inner chamber where the final rites occurred. Whatever they saw in that space left them forever changed. Many described it as a moment of enlightenment, an intimate encounter with divine truth. No one ever wrote down what happened. That's how deeply the vow of silence was respected. The Eleusinian Mysteries weren't about pleasure for its own sake. They were about transformation, the possibility that sensuality and divinity might meet, not in opposition, but in union. In a world where death was a constant presence, Eleusis offered hope that perhaps through darkness came light, through descent, return, and through sacred union, eternal renewal. While Western rites often wrapped sensuality in myth or secrecy, ancient India took a more direct approach, and a more spiritual approach. Enter Tantra, a complex, often misunderstood tradition that regarded sexual energy not as a sin, but as a sacred force, a divine spark that, if harnessed properly, could lead to enlightenment. Tantra is not a single religion or doctrine. It emerged across various schools of Hinduism and Buddhism, evolving over centuries. At its core, however, is the belief that the physical and spiritual worlds are not separate. To reach the divine, one doesn't escape the body, one fully inhabits it. Some tantric sects developed intricate rituals designed to transform everyday acts, eating, breathing, even intimacy into paths toward liberation. Among the most famous and most controversial of these were the tantric sex rites, which involved carefully structured encounters between partners. These weren't about indulgence. They were sacred ceremonies performed with meditation, breath control, and chants. Every movement had symbolic meaning. Every moment was intentional. The male represented Shiva, stillness, consciousness. The female embodied Shakti, energy, and creation. Their union mirrored the merging of opposites, the eternal dance between chaos and order, spirit and matter. The goal wasn't pleasure, but transcendence, a glimpse of divinity through the lens of desire. But let's clear up a common myth. Not all Tantra involved sexual rituals. In fact, most tantric practices were deeply ascetic. Chanting, visualizations, yoga, and intense focus were central. The sexual aspect, when present, was just one doorway among many, and often shrouded in layers of symbolism. That made its meaning difficult to decode. That said, some texts, like the Kama Sutra, often mistaken for a mere manual of positions, were rooted in the same worldview. Pleasure wasn't condemned. It was studied, refined, and placed within a larger spiritual system. In medieval temples such as Khajuraho and Konark, sculptures of intertwined lovers adorn the stone walls not as decoration, but as declaration. The path to the sacred runs through the senses. To ancient tantrics, desire was not a distraction, it was fuel, and when lit with wisdom and reverence, it could burn a path straight to the heart of the universe. Before Babylon, before Egypt's golden dynasties, there was Sumer, one of the world's first civilizations, and in its bustling temple complexes, particularly in the city of Uruk. The roots of sacred sexuality were already growing. At the heart of it all was the goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar, and her enigmatic priestesses, women whose bodies were vessels for divine power. These women were not ordinary prostitutes. They were known as hierodols, sacred servants. Their sexuality was ritualized, honored, and seen as part of the cosmic order. In Sumerian texts and hymns, Inanna is described as a passionate, sensuous deity who celebrated love, fertility, and pleasure. Her temple ceremonies reflected this ethos, the merging of the spiritual and physical into a single holistic form of worship. One of the most fascinating rituals believed to have taken place was the sacred marriage rite each year during the New Year festival. The king of the land would symbolically marry the goddess through a high priestess. The ceremony involved music, offerings, poetry, and, according to many scholars, physical union. This wasn't seen as mere spectacle. It was the centerpiece of the city's renewal. By reenacting the goddess's divine union with her lover Dumuzi, the king was legitimized, the crops were blessed, and the cycle of life was renewed even outside this major event. Sacred sexuality was part of the rhythm of temple life. The priestesses of Inanna were trained in music, dance, incantation, and the arts of love. For those who sought spiritual purification or divine favor, union with a hierodule was thought to bring healing, insight, or fertility. It was a rite, not a transaction. The role wasn't without complexity. Some of these women held powerful positions and lived within the protective walls of the temple, while others may have existed on its periphery, vulnerable to exploitation. Over time, the sacred faded, and later empires painted these practices in less favorable light, collapsing the divine into the profane. But in ancient Sumer, the body wasn't something to repress. It was a channel through which the divine flowed like river water across fertile earth. And in the sacred chambers of Inanna, love was more than emotion. It was a ritual. Far from the temples of the Near East and the mystic rituals of India, the ancient Celts celebrated fertility with fire, freedom, and forests. Their sacred festival was called Beltane, held on the eve of May, a liminal time between spring and summer, when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural blurred. It was a celebration of life, growth, and desire, and it was anything but modest. The Celts believed that the world pulsed with spiritual energy, spirits in trees, rivers, stones, and during Beltane, the energy of reproduction and rebirth reached its peak. Large bonfires were lit across hilltops, symbolizing purification and protection. People would dance around the flames, leap through the smoke for blessings, and even lead livestock between twin fires to guard them from illness in the coming season. But it was what happened after the firelight dimmed that gave Beltane its legendary reputation. Unmarried men and women would venture into the woods together for what was known as greenwood marriages. These were temporary unions, free from societal rules and often consummated under the stars. It wasn't considered scandalous. Quite the opposite. These encounters were viewed as sacred acts aligned with the fertility of the earth. To join with a partner on Beltane night was to participate in the cosmic rhythms of nature, to mirror the union of the Earth Mother and the horned god, the divine, masculine, and feminine. Some accounts suggest that even married couples might briefly suspend their vows for the night, not out of infidelity, but out of reverence for tradition and renewal. Children conceived during Beltane were sometimes called children of the fire, believed to be blessed with strength and vitality. It was a festival where rules softened, desire was acknowledged, and life itself was celebrated in its rawest form. There were no temples. Nature was the altar, the forest, the bedchamber, the flame, the witness. With the arrival of Christianity, many of these practices were condemned or suppressed. But echoes of Beltane survive in modern May Day rituals, folk dances, and quiet whispers of the old ways. By the time Christianity spread across Europe and the Near East, the sacred sexuality of the ancient world faced a quiet extinction. What had once been ritual, performed in temples, forests, and festivals, was increasingly rebranded as sin. The body, once seen as a vessel of divine energy, was recast as a source of temptation. Pleasure became something to be resisted, not revered. But the shift didn't happen overnight. In its earliest days, Christianity wasn't yet the institutional power it would become. It grew in the margins among mystics, ascetics, and radical thinkers. Some of these early sects, like the Gnostics, held beliefs that echoed older spiritual systems. They saw the physical world, including sexuality, as a metaphor for higher truths. Some Gnostic texts even framed the union of male and female as a mirror of the divine unity between spiritual opposites, reminiscent of tantric ideas from India or the symbolic marriages of Suna. One particularly mysterious sect, known as the Capocratians, reportedly practiced spiritual rituals that included physical union, believing that true enlightenment required experiencing all things, including desire, without shame or fear. These fringe communities were quickly labeled heretical by the emerging church, their writings destroyed or buried. But hints remain in dusty codices, gospels excluded from the Bible, and the quiet survival of old symbols repurposed for new dogma. As orthodoxy tightened its grip, rituals of sacred sexuality were driven underground. Temples were razed or converted. Festivals like Beltane were rebranded or forbidden. The sacred prostitute became a sinner. The sensual mystic became a heretic. But people, being people, remembered in secret, in story, in symbol. Medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote of divine ecstasy that sounded suspiciously physical. Visionaries described spiritual rapture using the language of union and passion, even saints. In their moments of closest communion with God, often used metaphors that blurred the line between body and spirit. And so the sacred didn't vanish. It transformed. What began in the groves of Eleusis, in the chambers of Inanna, and in the forests of the Celts never truly died. It went underground into poetry, into dreams, into memory, because temples can be destroyed and rituals forbidden. The human longing to merge the physical with the divine, that's eternal. In the shadowed corridors of ancient Athens, where reason was supposed to triumph over vengeance, poison was handed down in a cup. In 399 BCE, the philosopher Socrates, one of the most influential minds in Western thought, was sentenced to death, not by sword nor by exile, but by hemlock. It was a strange trial from the start. Socrates, a man who owned no property, wrote no books and claimed to know nothing, was accused of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. In truth, he had become a thorn in the side of the Athenian elite, questioning authority, mocking self-proclaimed wise men, and teaching his students to do the same. His very method, asking relentless questions, was seen not as education, but as sedition. The court offered him alternatives. He could suggest a lighter punishment, a fine exile, anything. But Socrates, as stubborn in death as in life, refused to beg. Instead, he proposed something absurd, that he would be rewarded for his service to Athens. The jury was not amused. The sentence? Death by hemlock. Hemlock was no dramatic assassin's blade. It was clinical, efficient, a slow paralysis that began in the limbs and crept upward until it reached the heart. No blood, no screams, just silence. On the final day, surrounded by friends and students, Socrates was cheerful. He bathed, said goodbye to his children, and took the poison with calm resignation. As the cold numbness reached his legs, he continued to speak about the immortality of the soul, discussing death not as an end, but as a transition. His followers wept. Socrates did not. He died with his mind intact, a final lesson in control, conviction, and principle. He could have escaped. His supporters had arranged it, but he chose to obey the law, even the unjust one, believing that undermining the city's order would do more harm than his death. And so Athens rid itself of its greatest critic, not with chains or torture, but with a cup of tea brewed from a lethal root. In killing Socrates, they didn't silence him. They made him immortal. Hemlock didn't stop his voice. It amplified it through time. When you think of Cleopatra, you likely picture the seductress queen draped in silk, whispering Latin to Julius Caesar and Greek to Mark Antony. But beyond politics and poetry, Cleopatra was also a student of science, particularly toxicology. She wasn't just beautiful, she was dangerous in ways few suspected. As ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra had access to one of the greatest libraries of the ancient world, and within those scrolls were secrets not just of the stars and gods, but of poisons, venoms, and their effects on the body and mind. She reportedly maintained a personal laboratory and even conducted experiments on prisoners, testing various concoctions to observe which toxins killed quickly, which caused agony, and which left no trace. She wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. In her world, poison was politics. It was preparation. Cleopatra didn't trust blades or battles to do the job when a drop of venom could be faster, quieter, and more precise. Assassination by poison was the scalpel in the toolkit of rulers, and Cleopatra was a surgeon. She studied nightshade, strychnine, hemlock, and aconite. She experimented with mixtures of snake venom and herbs. Some poisons caused hallucinations. Others mimicked illness. Some killed within moments. Others took hours, allowing time for confessions or blame to be redirected. And then, of course, there's the wasp, the snake she supposedly used to end her own life. Legend says that when Octavian, later Augustus Caesar conquered Egypt. Cleopatra refused to be paraded through Rome as a captive. Instead, she clasped an ASP to her breast and allowed the venom to claim her. But even this death is debated. Some historians believe she may have swallowed a fast-acting poison hidden in a hairpin or ointment. After all, Cleopatra would have known which poisons caused convulsions and which brought a graceful death. The ASP may have simply been the perfect symbol, a quiet sting for a queen too proud to be caged. To Cleopatra, poison wasn't a crime, it was control. It was the art of deciding who lives, who dies, and how history would remember her. And if her enemies underestimated her because of her charm, they often never lived long enough to regret it. In the Roman Empire, power didn't just corrupt, it poisoned literally. Behind the golden columns of the imperial palace, poison became the preferred method for eliminating rivals. No messy civil wars, no public executions, just a cup of wine, a bowl of figs, and a corpse before dessert. The emperors were no strangers to betrayal, and few trusted their own inner circles in the 1st century CE, under the rule of Emperor Claudius. Poison entered its golden age thanks to one woman, Locusta, Rome's most infamous professional poisoner. Locusta wasn't just some shadowy figure in a back alley with a vial. She was a trained expert, practically a chemist by ancient standards who served the political ambitions of the powerful. When Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's wife, wanted her son Nero on the throne, she called on Locusta. The result? A carefully poisoned dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite, and a rapid decline in imperial health. But the drama didn't stop there. Once Nero became emperor, he employed Locusta like a royal assassin. When his teenage stepbrother Britannicus posed a threat to his throne, Locusta was again summoned. The young prince died mid-banquet, convulsing in front of horrified guests. Nero was so impressed. He gave Locusta a full pardon, land, and even students to train in her deadly craft. In Rome, poison was the weapon of the educated, aristocratic, subtle, and difficult to trace. While blades left witnesses, poison left doubt. Was it an illness? Indigestion? Divine punishment? The paranoia it bred was enormous. Cups were tested, food was tasted. Even slaves became suspects. Rome developed elaborate defenses. Silver spoons to detect toxins, antidotes made of crushed emeralds, and the famous theriac, a universal antidote made from dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh. Yet none of it could stop the slow tide of quiet deaths. Poison in Rome was more than a tool. It was a language, a silent negotiation between survival and ambition, and in the halls of marble and blood, it whispered louder than swords. In ancient China, poison was less a crime and more an art. Among the imperial courts of the Han, Tang, and Ming dynasties, it became a subtle language of power, used in whispers, silk sleeves, and teacups. No grand gestures, just a soft breath and then silence. The Chinese elite were masters of pharmacology. Traditional medicine blurred the lines between healing and harm. A pinch too much of an herb, and the cure became the killer. Court alchemists and palace physicians walked a tightrope, creating antidotes one day, poisons the next. But the true experts of this quiet war were often women, particularly imperial consorts and concubines. Forbidden from wielding swords or political titles, some turned to more discreet methods. A rival could be removed not through scandal, but through sickness. The Empress Dowager might never raise her voice. Only her eyebrow, and days later a challenger would be coughing blood in bed. One infamous example is Empress Liu Ji of the Han Dynasty. After securing power, she systematically eliminated threats to her rule, including rivals within the harem. Her methods were grim, including poisoning and slow mutilation. She wasn't just feared, she was legendary, a ruler who used medicine not to heal the empire, but to bend it. Even beyond the palace walls, poison was a feared political weapon. Assassins of secret societies, like the Five Poison Sect, were rumored to coat blades with toxic herbs or slip lethal tinctures into ceremonial wine. Poison wasn't just effective, it was theatrical. A statement, it said, "I can reach you even here." Because of this, China developed one of the most advanced systems of poison detection. In the ancient world, officials tested meals with silver chopsticks, believing they would tarnish in the presence of arsenic. Imperial kitchens became mini laboratories, not just for flavor, but for safety. In China, poison wasn't impulsive. It was precise, ritualistic, a chess move, not a brawl. And though rarely seen, it ruled dynasties just as surely as emperors did in the ancient courts of India. There existed a tale so chilling it sounds like mythology, yet appears in royal texts, legends, and political treatises. These were the Vishakanyas, or poison maidens, women whose very bodies were said to be lethal, not because they carried daggers, but because they were the dagger. The legend says that certain young girls, chosen at a very early age, were slowly fed minute doses of poison day after day, drop by drop. Their bodies would build immunity, but in turn, their blood, sweat, and even breath became toxic to others, especially lovers. A kiss from a Vishakanya, it was said, could mean death. Intimacy wasn't passion, it was execution. This practice allegedly began under Chanakya, a cunning strategist and royal advisor to Chandragupta Maurya around the 4th century BCE. Chanakya was a firm believer in espionage and psychological warfare. According to the Arthashastra, an ancient political manual attributed to him, poison was not just a tool of war, it was a tool of statecraft. Enemies could be seduced and slain without raising a single sword. Were the Vishakanyas real? That's still debated. Some scholars think they were metaphorical symbols of seductive danger or cautionary tales against courtly temptation. Others argue there may have been real attempts to create such assassins through gradual poisoning, a practice known in Ayurveda and ancient medicine as Vishakrama. Even if they were legends, the fear they invoked was real. Foreign dignitaries were warned, meals were tested, and any beautiful stranger arriving at court might be seen not as a gift, but a threat in silk. Poison in India wasn't always hidden in goblets. Sometimes it wore jewelry, smiled sweetly, and danced in royal courts. And this idea that beauty could kill fed centuries of intrigue, suspicion, and countermeasures. What made the Vishakanya myth so terrifying wasn't just the poison, it was the intimacy of the danger. Death didn't ride into battle. It leaned in close and whispered if ever a king saw threats in every shadow. It was Herod the Great, ruler of Judea under Roman authority in the 1st century BCE. A man of grand architecture, brutal politics, and deep insecurities, Herod didn't trust swords alone to keep him on the throne. In his court, poison was paranoia made liquid. Herod's reign was infamous for its violence, but not all of his executions were public spectacles. Some were private, very private. As his power grew, so did his fear of rivals, of Roman suspicion, and most tragically, of his own family. His wife, Miriam, a Hasmonean princess of noble blood, was once the love of his life. But Herod became convinced, wrongly, that she plotted against him. She was executed. So were her mother, her grandfather, and eventually his own sons, according to Josephus. The ancient Jewish historian, Herod had Miriam's sons poisoned in secret, under the guise of Roman justice. They were popular, legitimate heirs with royal Jewish blood, and that made them dangerous. Herod couldn't allow any future coup to have a noble figurehead. The poisonings didn't stop there. Herod used informants, interrogators, and yes, poisons, to quietly eliminate anyone who even appeared disloyal. Ministers, servants, relatives. Some were drugged to induce confessions. Others were simply removed with no explanation, their illnesses blamed on divine wrath or bad air. Poison allowed Herod to rule with surgical cruelty. It didn't stir public unrest like crucifixions or beheadings. It was clean, it was discreet, and it sent a message. No one was untouchable, not even those who shared his bloodline. Herod's obsession with poison extended beyond assassination. In his final days, racked with disease and madness, he feared his own death would go unmourned. He ordered that prominent Jewish leaders be gathered and executed upon his death to ensure there would be national grief. Thankfully, that order was never carried out, but the paranoia that filled his court had long poisoned his legacy in the grand halls of Persepolis. Amid golden columns and carved reliefs of warriors and lions, another battle was unfolding, one not of armies, but of whispers and goblets. In the Achaemenid Empire, where kings ruled continents, poison became a tool of refinement, elegant, deadly, and often invisible. The Persian court under kings like Darius the Great and Xerxes was a place of opulence and ceremony, but was also a hive of political maneuvering, palace rivalries, and dynastic ambition. With dozens of wives, concubines, sons, satraps, and generals all vying for influence, poison was a quiet equalizer. Historical records from Greek sources, especially the ever-dramatic Herodotus, tell of assassination plots cloaked in luxury. Food tasters were standard practice, and kitchens were locked down like military zones. The mere suspicion of poisoning was enough to see a cook or cupbearer executed on the spot. One infamous figure was Bagoas, a Persian eunuch and court official who rose to immense power under Artaxerxes III in the 4th century BCE. According to accounts, Bagoas poisoned not just his enemies, but the king himself, and then installed a puppet monarch, only to poison him too when he proved difficult. Bagoas controlled the court not through armies, but through apothecary jars. Persian knowledge of herbal medicine was advanced, and so was their understanding of toxins. From aconite to arsenic, they experimented with subtle agents, slow-acting substances that mimicked natural illness or fast ones that struck like lightning. Poison wasn't just a method of execution, it was an art form of discretion. Because in Persia, power was built on appearances. To kill publicly was to risk scandal. But poison let the empire breathe easily, while its enemies died quietly in their beds. A noble would go to sleep feeling victorious and never wake. Even Alexander the Great's death, which occurred shortly after conquering Persia, was rumored to be from a poison derived from Eastern knowledge, slipped into his wine during a banquet in Babylon. Whether true or not, the suspicion reveals the reputation Persians held for invisible warfare. In the Achaemenid Empire, kings reigned through image, wealth, and order. Though less theatrical than the palaces of Rome or the harems of Persia, ancient Israel and its surrounding cultures did not exist outside the reach of poison. In fact, the Bible contains several curious references to deadly herbs, tainted drinks, and divine tests involving toxic brews, suggesting that poison was known, feared, and sometimes used as proof of guilt or innocence. One of the strangest examples comes from the Book of Numbers, where a ritual called the Ordeal of Bitter Water is described. If a man suspected his wife of adultery, he could take her to a priest who would mix holy water with dust from the temple floor and force her to drink it. The idea was simple. If she was guilty, the cursed drink would swell her belly and curse her womb. If she was innocent, nothing would happen. This wasn't just divine intervention. It was an early form of trial by poison, a dangerous liquid used not to kill outright, but to provoke a reaction and extract truth. Elsewhere in Scripture, poison appears more metaphorically, but still with dark weight. In Deuteronomy, the land of Israel is warned against worshiping false gods, with threats that the people's food and water would be cursed. Gall and wormwood, both known in antiquity for their bitterness and toxicity. In Job, poison is compared to injustice, and in the Psalms the wicked are said to have poison under their tongues, a symbol of deception and deadly intent. There's also Herod, who appears in the New Testament and whose reputation for poison we covered earlier, linking biblical history with a greater story of toxic politics in the ancient world. While we don't see dramatic assassinations by poison in the core biblical text, the awareness of its power was certainly there. The Hebrews lived among empires where poison was a courtly art, and they adapted their own legal and spiritual interpretations to fit that dangerous reality. Across the empires of antiquity, from the halls of Athens to the sands of Egypt, from the palaces of Rome to the forests of India, one weapon remained universal: elegant and terrifying poison. It required no army. It left no battlefield. It killed without noise, without witnesses, and often without blame. In an age where brute force ruled the public square, poison was the preferred tool of the private war. The conflicts fought behind curtains in bedrooms, banquet halls, and temples. It was a political equalizer, a whisper of death where a shout might bring chaos. But poison was more than a method. It was a message. In ancient times, to die by the sword was honorable. It meant you were a threat worth confronting openly. To die by poison, however, was something else entirely. It meant someone close to you, someone trusted, had made a choice. Poison always involved betrayal, a servant, a spouse, a cupbearer, or a family member. It turned every bite into a gamble, every goblet into a test of loyalty. The ancient world respected poison's subtlety. Philosophers saw it as a symbol of fate, a punishment, a power to disguise as grace. Religions invoked it as divine judgment, and rulers used it to maintain the illusion of peace while quietly rewriting their bloodlines. What makes poison so enduring is its paradox. It is at once cowardly and clever, invisible yet unforgettable. It doesn't just kill the body. It erodes trust, leaves suspicion, and casts long shadows on legacies. Even today, its mythology lingers. The hemlock of Socrates, Cleopatra's ASP, the poisoned figs of Claudius, the Vishakanyas of India. These are more than deaths. They are parables. Remind us that in the theater of power, the deadliest actors are often those who never take the stage. Poison has no face, no voice, no armor. But in ancient history, it shaped dynasties, rewrote successions, and whispered through every corridor of power. It was, and still is, the perfect assassin. It all began with wood, dust, and ingenuity along the banks of the Nile. In ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, priests, and precision, protecting one's possessions was more than practical. It was symbolic. Whether it was grain stored for famine, papyrus scrolls hidden in temple chambers, or treasures entombed with a pharaoh, access had to be controlled. And for that, they invented something revolutionary, pin tumbler lock dating back as early as 2000 BC. These were the world's first known mechanical locks. Carved entirely from wood, the device was rudimentary by modern standards, but conceptually brilliant. The lock consisted of a horizontal bolt that slid into a frame to secure a door. The bolt had holes drilled into it, and when it was pushed into place, a set of vertical pins dropped down into those holes from above, locking it shut. To unlock it, you needed a key, but not just any key. This early Egyptian key was a large wooden instrument, often resembling a toothbrush with pegs. When inserted into the lock's top, the key lifted the pins out of the bolt holes, allowing the bolt to slide open. No brute force, no chisel, just design and gravity. This was more than just a gadget. It was a philosophy of protection for the Egyptians who believed in order. Mahat over chaos is fed. The idea of regulating access, of closing a chamber, of choosing who enters and who does not, carry deep meaning. Locks were used in homes, temples, and tombs. Pharaohs were buried with sealed chambers, sometimes with locked doors and false passages. Security wasn't just about possessions, it was about eternity. What's astonishing is how familiar this technology feels. The basic pin and key concept behind the wooden Egyptian lock still exists in modern metal locks today. Pins dropping into holes, keys lifting them into alignment. It's a 4,000-year-old idea, unchanged in principle. Though the wooden mechanisms eventually decayed and few original keys survived, the design was so effective it spread. It whispered its way from Egypt to the Greeks, then to the Romans, and eventually the rest of the world. Before tumblers clicked and bolts slid into place, there were seals, the silent sentinels of ancient Mesopotamia. In the cities of Ur, Babylon, and Nineveh, locks as we know them weren't yet common. But the people of Mesopotamia had already developed a remarkably effective way to secure, authenticate, and restrict access. Their solution wasn't mechanical. It was symbolic. Enter the cylinder seal. These small, intricately carved cylinders were worn around the neck or wrist like a ring or pendant. Each seal was unique, a personal signature, often etched with mythological scenes, animals, gods, or even cuneiform inscriptions. To use it, a person would roll the cylinder across a soft surface of wet clay, leaving behind a long impression, a kind of ancient barcode. Seals were used to close jars, secure doorways, and protect caskets. If someone tried to break in, the clay seal would crack, making tampering obvious. More than that, the impression itself verified who had closed the container or room. You didn't need a key to open it. You needed a reason to break the seal. It was primitive, yes, but also incredibly effective in a society where reputation and official marks carried enormous weight. In temples, priests sealed sacred storerooms with their personal sigils. Merchants sealed contracts. Even kings used seals to lock away correspondence. Entire economies operated under the authority of this little carved token. Security in Mesopotamia wasn't about denial of access through force, but about proof of legitimacy. If the seal was intact, the contents were safe. If it was broken, something was wrong. The seal system also introduced another radical concept: identity as security. The seal wasn't just a tool. It was a mark of trust, authority, and often legal power. Lose your seal, and you didn't just misplace a tool. You lost your name. It's no exaggeration to say that these cylinder seals were the earliest form of two-factor authentication. Not a password, not a PIN, but a physical artifact that said, "This is mine, and only I have the right to open it." While the Mesopotamians relied on seals and the Egyptians mastered wooden pin locks, the ancient Greeks brought a new kind of craftsmanship to personal security. With their growing cities, private homes, temples, and treasuries, the Greeks began to develop more compact, durable, and practical locking mechanisms. And with them came the rise of the locksmith, a specialized trade in the ancient world. Greek locks were a step forward from Egypt's bulky wooden designs. They often used metal components, though many parts were still fashioned from wood due to resource constraints and cost. The most common form was the bolt lock, where a sliding bar fit into a catch or groove in the doorframe. It was secured in place with a metal pin or peg. It could only be released using a specially shaped key, often made of bronze or iron. But Greek keys weren't the small pocket versions we know today. These were long L-shaped rods, sometimes nearly as long as a human form. To unlock the door, the key was inserted into a vertical keyhole and used to lift and manipulate internal pins or pegs, allowing the bolt to slide free. The motion was both physical and symbolic. To carry a key was to carry authority, and to use it was to assert control over a space. Temples used locks to secure votive offerings. Wealthy citizens locked chests filled with coinage or jewelry. Even public buildings had secured archives and storerooms. The technology wasn't widespread. Most common homes relied on wooden latches or simple bars. But in the world of aristocrats, scholars, and priests, the lock became an object of both function and status. What set the Greeks apart was not just the mechanics, but the philosophy behind their locks. Security, in Athens especially, was tied to property rights and citizenship. A locked door meant privacy, ownership, autonomy, and the locksmith was no longer a mere artisan. He was a technician of trust in an era defined by public debate and private drama. The Greek lock was the silent partner, keeping secrets safe behind oak doors and stone vaults. If the Greeks laid the groundwork, the Romans refined it. By the height of the Roman Empire, locks were no longer experimental. They were everywhere, in homes, in temples, in shops, and on the wrists of slaves. The Romans brought structure to everything they touched: roads, laws, armies, and security was no exception. Roman locks became smaller, stronger, and smarter. They used metal components, primarily bronze and iron, which meant these locks lasted longer and were harder to tamper with. The most common type was the warded lock, a system where only a key with the correct notches could rotate within the lock to move the bolt. The wards were fixed internal obstacles, and if your key didn't have the right cuts, it simply wouldn't turn. This led to the invention of the skeleton key, a stripped-down key that could bypass the wards in simpler locks. Romans loved this trick. So did thieves. But the real marvel was the Roman puzzle lock. Small, intricately crafted mechanisms often built into boxes or chests. These locks required not just the right key, but sometimes a sequence of movements or pressure points to unlock. Some even used false keyholes to throw off would-be intruders. These were the ancient world's version of a combination safe. Roman keys themselves were often small and elegant, sometimes worn as rings, a convenient blend of utility and jewelry. It was common for Roman citizens to wear their keys on their fingers as a status symbol. If you had a key, it meant you owned something worth locking up. Interestingly, some locks were also placed on slave collars, marked with inscriptions like "if found, returned to master." These locks weren't protecting treasure. They were enforcing ownership. Chilling, but a reminder that security in Rome wasn't always about valuables. It was also about power. The Roman Empire's approach to locks wasn't just practical, it was personal. Keys were made to fit your lock and no one else's. They protected not just gold, but letters, heirlooms, recipes, and sometimes secrets. While the West refined its keys and bolts, the East was quietly crafting elegant mechanical marvels of its own. In ancient China, lockmaking wasn't just a matter of utility. It was a reflection of balance, precision, and sometimes even spiritual harmony. By the Zhou dynasty around 1000 BCE, Chinese artisans were producing all-metal locks, often made from bronze and later iron. These were compact, portable, and mechanically sophisticated. Unlike the large, visible systems used in Egypt or Greece, Chinese locks were designed to be discreet and efficient, often built into chests, cabinets, and even gates. The most iconic form was the Chinese padlock, or suo. These were usually barrel-shaped or rectangular, with a flat key inserted from one end. Inside, a series of spring-loaded tumblers or pins would align when the right key was inserted, allowing the bolt to slide free. Sound familiar? It should. The pin tumbler design mirrored the same logic the Egyptians had pioneered centuries earlier, but the Chinese took it further by miniaturizing it and improving durability. Some locks were shaped like animals or mythical creatures, dragons, tigers, turtles. Combining practical use with symbolic protection, a tiger-shaped lock on your chest wasn't just security, it was spiritual defense. The design conveyed power, guardianship, and often luck. China also developed trick locks, early versions of puzzle locks that required multiple steps or deceptive angles to open. These weren't just used to guard money or jewelry. Scholars and officials stored important documents, calligraphy, or family heirlooms in locked boxes that could only be opened by someone who understood the mechanism. Security was about intellect, not just ownership. Locksmithing became a respected trade. Some artisans kept their techniques secret, passing them down through families. Others innovated new forms that traveled along the Silk Road, influencing security systems as far as the Middle East. In the heart of ancient India, amid temples, scrolls, and intricate palace corridors, security was treated not merely as protection, but as art, ritual, and sometimes even spiritual safeguard. Though India's ancient locks haven't survived in as large numbers as Roman or Chinese counterparts, references in Sanskrit texts and archaeological finds suggest that by the time of the Maurya Empire, around 300 BC, mechanical locks were not only in use, they were evolving in clever and culturally distinct ways. Indian locks were often used to secure temples, treasure rooms, and storage chests, many of which contained not just wealth but sacred relics or royal documentation. These locks were primarily metal, small in size, and employed internal levers or pin systems, some using sliding tumblers similar to Chinese and Roman designs. But ancient Indian ingenuity took a special turn toward camouflage security. Carved wooden panels in temples and royal palaces would sometimes conceal hidden compartments or false drawers, protected by secret trigger locks that only a select few knew how to operate. A push in the right spot, a twist of a carved leaf, and a panel would spring open or shut. Some of these mechanisms still baffle modern restorers, built with such precision and mystery, that they border on architectural riddles. Sanskrit texts like the Arthashastra, a political and economic treatise from the Maurya era, detail the importance of guarding information, treasure, and royal property using secret rooms, double doors, and disguise locks. These weren't just mechanical, they were psychological. The idea was not only to keep intruders out, but to prevent them from even realizing something needed protecting. Locks in India were also deeply symbolic. A temple gate might be locked not just for security, but as part of a ritual cycle opened only on auspicious days. Certain lock designs incorporated lotus flowers, serpents, or sacred geometry, acting as both deterrent and blessing. In Indian philosophy, protection wasn't always about confrontation. It was about redirection, illusion, and wisdom in the misty forests and icy fjords of ancient northern Europe. Locks weren't simply tools of convenience. They were statements of territory, symbols of ownership, and at times, charms against the unknown. Among the Celts, whose societies flourished across Iron Age Britain and Gaul, security was more practical than ornamental. Their homes and granaries often relied on heavy wooden bars, iron door rings, and sliding bolts. Yet archaeological digs at Celtic sites have unearthed padlocks and keys, often simple in design, but made with surprising precision. Early evidence of iron-forged warded locks, much like those used in the Roman world. It's likely that these technologies spread through contact with Roman traders or occupying forces. But for the Celts, protection wasn't always mechanical. It was spiritual. Homes were guarded with charms, symbols, and ritual markings on thresholds to ward off not just thieves, but spirits. A locked door may have kept out raiders, but a carved triskel or hanging amulet was meant to keep out mischievous fairies or vengeful ghosts. In their worldview, security wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. The Norse, too, took locks seriously, especially when it came to storage and seafaring. Viking ships and chests were often equipped with iron padlocks designed to withstand weather, theft, and sabotage. Some Norse keys were found with burial goods shaped like serpents, axes, or even miniature Thor's hammers. These were both functional tools and symbols of authority. To carry a key was to own, command, and protect. Women in Viking society often held the keys to the household, quite literally. Archaeological finds show women buried with elaborate key rings and belt-hung lockpicks. In a way, the key wasn't just about entry. It was status, trust, and identity. Interestingly, Norse mythology itself touches on locking and unlocking. The gods used runes to seal doors, and certain spells were designed to bind or unbind fate, echoing the symbolic power of locks beyond the physical world. So while the North may not have had the ornate puzzle locks of Rome or the philosophical elegance of China, their locks told their own story. One forged in iron, tradition, and superstition. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the Byzantine Empire rose in the east, carrying forward Roman engineering and its love for locks. But Byzantium didn't just preserve ancient designs, it refined them, combining Roman mechanics with Eastern elegance while passing on security technology into the Islamic Golden Age. Byzantine locks were often miniature masterpieces. Their padlocks, shaped like animals, crosses, or abstract patterns, were made from bronze or iron and used advanced ward systems that required precisely cut keys. Many Byzantine locks incorporated rotating bolts, spring-loaded mechanisms, and false keyholes, laying the groundwork for modern puzzle locks. The tradition of wearing keys as badges of status continued. Bishops and abbots often carried ceremonial keys to churches and archives, emphasizing access as sacred privilege. But it was in the Islamic caliphates, especially during the Abbasid era, that the science of security blossomed into both art and innovation. Building on knowledge from Persia, India, Greece, and Rome, Islamic craftsmen elevated lockmaking to a highly respected trade. The Abbasids, ruling from Baghdad, developed extremely sophisticated lock systems, some with 4 or 5 internal levers, intricate tumblers, and even early combination mechanisms. Their padlocks were both beautiful and cunning. Brass locks shaped like lions, fish, or birds were not only functional, they were statements. Arabic inscriptions often adorned the sides, praising Allah or stating the owner's name. Fusing faith, identity, and security, Islamic scholars also wrote treatises on mechanical devices. Al-Jazari, the 12th century Muslim inventor, famously documented dozens of mechanisms, including water clocks and automatic locks, some of which involve complex gears and hidden triggers. He is often regarded as one of the earliest mechanical engineers in history, and many of his principles still inform lock making today. Islamic markets and palaces relied on these evolving locks to secure everything from treasure chests and religious relics to library doors and merchant stalls. In a time when science and theology walked hand in hand, a well-made lock wasn't just protection, it was a reflection of divine order and human mastery. By the end of antiquity, locks had evolved far beyond bolts and bars. They had become symbols of civilization itself, tools that reflected a society's values, fears, and ambitions. Whether forged in iron, carved in wood, or hidden behind sacred geometry, ancient locks weren't just about keeping things out. They were about deciding who got to come in. From the wooden pin tumblers of Egypt to the mechanical puzzles of Byzantium, every culture added a layer to the story. Each key held power, not just practical, but psychological. To possess a key was to hold authority, access, and often secrecy. Locks told you who ruled the house, who controlled the grain, who had the right to touch the scroll, open the shrine, or enter the tomb. And as technology advanced, so did the theatrics of protection. False keyholes, hidden compartments, locks shaped like lions or wrapped in inscriptions. These weren't just defenses, they were messages. They said, I am valuable. I am protected. I know something you don't. Even more fascinating is how locks were shaped by, and in turn shape human behavior. In cultures that valued hierarchy, locks reinforced boundaries. In societies with fluid trade and diverse populations, they protected marketplaces, homes, and temples from mistrust and theft in religious systems. They safeguarded the sacred, not just from humans, but from the impure, the unworthy, the uninitiated. And then there's the paradox. The more advanced locks became, the more lockpickers followed. Just as every civilization developed better security, others learned how to bypass it. The cat and mouse game we know today. It started thousands of years ago in a Mesopotamian grain vault or a Roman merchant's chest. Ultimately, ancient locks offer more than a glimpse into engineering. They give us insight into the human condition, our desire for safety, our tendency towards suspicion, our need to draw lines between public and private, and our relentless DR to protect what we value. Because even in the ancient world, a locked door wasn't just a barrier. It was a declaration, a quiet, enduring whisper that said this matters. This is mine, and only I may open it. Juana of Castile was born in 1479, the third child of two very important people who were also very related. Her parents were Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the same power couple who financed Columbus, kicked out the Moors, and somehow thought cousin marriage was still a solid strategic move. Juana came from the Spanish Trastamara dynasty, which already had a strong tradition of marrying within the family. By the time she arrived, the royal bloodline had been stirred just enough to be technically alive, but not enough to avoid issues like emotional instability, chronic melancholy, and the occasional unfortunate chin. In her teens, Juana was shipped off to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, who, despite the name, was less handsome and more genetically optimized. Habsburg. He was her cousin. Of course he was. The Habsburgs loved two things: collecting crowns and ignoring genetic warnings. At first, things looked promising. Juana was intelligent, striking, and reportedly very much in love with Philip. Unfortunately, Philip was less in love with her, and more in love with every woman who wasn't his wife. Juana's passionate nature and jealousy didn't go over well with a court that was used to cold marriages and lukewarm fidelity. When Philip died suddenly, allegedly from typhoid, possibly from karma, Juana didn't take it well. She refused to be separated from his corpse, like refused. She had his coffin carried with her as she traveled across Spain, occasionally opening it to check on him. Medieval romantic, maybe unhinged. Also maybe her political enemies, and she had many jumped on this behavior. Her father, Ferdinand, used it as proof she was unfit to rule. Her son Charles, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, did the same. Conveniently, both men got to rule in her place while she remained under care in a convent for most of her life. Was Juana actually mad? Historians still debate it. Some say she suffered from mental illness, exacerbated by grief and confinement. Others argue she was just politically inconvenient in a world where being an emotional woman, especially one who noticed her husband's cheating, was basically considered treason. Either way, Juana wasn't just a tragic figure. She was a perfect storm of royal pressure, dynastic inbreeding, and the world's worst coping mechanisms. If there were a prize for most predictable genetic outcome, Maria Anna of Spain would be holding the trophy while her son drooled on it. Born in 1634, Maria Anna was the daughter of King Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, who were themselves cousins in that uniquely enthusiastic Habsburg way. So naturally, Maria Anna married her uncle. That's right, not distant cousins, not second cousins twice removed, but her actual uncle, Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Because when your family tree is just a loop with ambition, why not double down? Maria Anna was intelligent and devout, fluent in several languages, politically aware and apparently kind-hearted. She brought dignity to the imperial court, along with the genetic equivalent of photocopying a photocopy. A most significant contribution to history, giving birth to Charles II of Spain. Arguably the most inbred monarch to ever sit on a throne without falling off, Charles inherited not just the crown, but the entire Habsburg gene backlog: an oversized jaw, a weak chin, chronic illness, infertility, and a suspected cognitive delay. He struggled with basic functions such as eating and speaking, which, to be fair, is relatable before coffee, but less so when you're ruling a global empire. Was all of this Maria Anna's fault? Of course not. She didn't invent Habsburg matchmaking, but she did play her part in the long-running family tradition of turning political alliances into genetic daredevils. To her credit, she deeply loved her son and was protective of him throughout his fragile life. She acted as regent during his minority and tried to shield him from court manipulation, which was like trying to stop a food fight in a room full of starving toddlers with daggers. Maria Anna died in 1696, a year after her son. The Spanish Empire she helped birth into decline soon collapsed into the War of Spanish Succession. A war triggered in part because Charles II couldn't produce an heir, because of course he couldn't. If you've ever wondered what happens when a family treats marriage like a spreadsheet formula, Isabella of Habsburg is your answer. Born in 1501, Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Handsome. Yes, that one again. And Juana of Castile, also known as Joanna the Mad, though at this point Joanna the understandably stressed might be more accurate. This made Isabella the sister of Emperor Charles V and the niece of half of Europe. Her DNA was less a mystery and more a royal recipe repeated too many times. A base of Habsburg, a dash of Trastamara, and absolutely no fresh ingredients at the age of 17. Isabella married Christian II of Denmark, a king famous for reform attempts, erratic behavior, and the general vibe of a man one poor breakfast away from declaring war on the furniture. Their union was, predictably, both strategic and deeply awkward. Isabella and Christian were cousins, of course, but what really sealed the genetic deal was that her Habsburg bloodline was already looping like a medieval screensaver. She was expected to bring stability, charm, and political advantage, and maybe also disguise the fact that her family tree was looking more and more like a wreath. Life in the Danish court was not kind to Isabella. Christian's rule went poorly. He was overthrown, imprisoned, and at one point exiled. Isabella followed him loyally, which is either true love or hereditary stubbornness. Her health declined during years of court drama and political exile, and she died young, at just 24, from what some suspect was complications related to childbirth or illness worsened by stress and royal politics. Their children continued the noble tradition of inbreeding naturally. One of them, Dorothea, married Frederick II Elector Palatine, a solid Habsburg match. Because if there's anything the dynasty valued more than jawlines and titles, it was ensuring that no family gathering ever needed name tags. Eleanor of Austria was born in 1498, which already puts her at a disadvantage, being sandwiched between the Renaissance and 1000 royal expectations. She was the daughter of Philip the Handsome and Juana of Castile, making her the older sister of Charles V and a proud owner of what can only be described as deluxe Habsburg genetics. Her childhood, diplomatic waiting room, her teenage years, a series of almost all marriages. At one point, she was promised to Henry VIII of England, but that fell through. Luckier. Dodging that particular marriage was one of the few times Habsburg inbreeding may have accidentally improved someone's quality of life. Instead, Eleanor's first marriage was to Manuel I of Portugal, who was not only a much older man, but also her first cousin once removed, which in the world of royal matrimony is basically the medieval version of marrying someone from down the hall. She became Queen of Portugal, had 2 children, and was widowed before she hit 30. So naturally, the solution was to marry her off again, this time to Francis I of France, a man who had previously been held prisoner by her brother Charles V. A romance. Francis wasn't particularly fond of Eleanor, viewing her less as a wife and more as a political olive branch with a Habsburg return address. Their marriage was childless and chilly. He spent more time with his mistresses than with his queen, while Eleanor spent most of her time reading, praying, and politely pretending not to notice. Despite being married to the King of France, Eleanor remained loyal to her Habsburg roots, and you can't blame her. They may have been inbred, but they were predictable. Eleanor outlived both her husbands and retired quietly into the political shadows, dying in 1558. She was known for her piety, composure, and a remarkable ability to survive two royal marriages without causing a scandal, an Olympic-level achievement in her family. Her life was a masterclass in silent endurance. Though she didn't spark wars or scandals, she embodied the Habsburg woman's job description. Marry the cousin, produce the heir, and pretend that the family resemblance isn't getting stronger with each generation. Catherine of Aragon was born in 1485 to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, Spain's power couple and part-time genealogical bottleneck. As a princess of two United Kingdoms, Catherine had everything: wealth, education, titles, and a family tree that circled tighter than a medieval drinking song. By the time she turned 3, Catherine was already betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of Henry VII. Why? Because Europe's royal families had a charming habit of marrying their cousins to other cousins, preferably in matching coats of arms. Catherine and Arthur were second cousins through John of Gaunt, which, in noble terms, is basically barely related. They married in 1501, and Arthur promptly died 5 months later. Did the marriage include relations? That question would come to define English history, spark the Reformation, and confuse lawyers for generations. In the meantime, Catherine was stuck in diplomatic limbo, teenage widow living in England. No husband, no dowry returned, and still very much a pawn in the game of royal alliances. Enter Henry VIII, Arthur's younger brother, and eventually her second husband. It's not every day you marry two sons from the same family. But hey, the Trastamers were all about reusing names, titles, and apparently spouses. Their early years were genuinely affectionate. Catherine was intelligent, graceful, and politically savvy. She gave Henry prestige, an alliance with Spain, and 5 pregnancies, only one of which survived. Mary, later known as Mary I. Unfortunately, Henry wanted a son, and Catherine, after years of miscarriages and heartache, couldn't deliver one. That's when things went from awkward to apocalyptic. Henry claimed their marriage was invalid because Catherine had been married to his brother. Catherine, backed by the Pope, insisted it was legitimate. Thus began the world's most dramatic annulment request, featuring theological debates, political threats, and one very determined king created his own church just to get out of it. Catherine was banished, stripped of her title, and forced to live out her days in isolation, still insisting to the end that she was Henry's rightful wife. Her royal blood may have been blue, but was also suspiciously concentrated. Her marriage helped shape English history, not through battle or diplomacy, but by reminding everyone that marrying within the family tree rarely ends quietly. Margaret of Austria was born in 1480, the only daughter of Emperor Maximilian of Austria and Mary of Burgundy. She was a Habsburg from birth, which means her family tree was essentially a circle drawn by an ambitious toddler with a crown. From the start, Margaret's life was all about strategic packaging. At age 3, she was engaged to Charles VIII of France. At age 12, she was returned like an aisle-fitting wedding gift when Charles decided to marry someone else, and a Brittany who came with better geography. Margaret, humiliated but composed, reportedly remarked, "I shall be revenged," and to her credit, she managed to rule half of Europe later. So fair play. Her second engagement was to Juan of Castile, son of Ferdinand and Isabella, and yes, her cousin. Naturally, the match was designed to cement Habsburg-Spanish relations and keep the gene pool as shallow as possible. Juan died shortly after their marriage, and Margaret, still under 20, was now twice rejected by royal husbands, once by choice, once by fate. She was offered other suitors, including one of Henry VII's sons, but Margaret declined. She had officially retired from the royal marriage roulette. She never remarried, dedicating her life instead to statecraft, art, and surviving her relatives, which was no small feat. Appointed governor of the Netherlands by her nephew Charles V, Margaret ran the region with intelligence, diplomacy, and sheer Habsburg grit. She negotiated treaties, balanced volatile provinces, and was one of the few women in Europe actually trusted with power, possibly because her last name was Habsburg, and also because she wasn't busy birthing her uncle's cousin's heir. Despite the endless dynastic drama around her, Margaret lived a relatively scandal-free life. She collected art, patronized music, and even tried to teach young Charles some basic ruling skills. A thankless task, considering he was emperor by 19 and related to almost everyone on the planet. Margaret died in 1530 after a relatively minor foot injury turned fatal. Because medieval medicine was just a very elaborate way of saying you'll probably die from that. She remains one of the few Habsburg women remembered more for her policies than her pedigree, though the pedigree, naturally, was still incredibly inbred. Blanche of Castile was born in 1188, a time when nobles still considered marrying your cousin a power move rather than a biology risk as the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And Henry II of England, and the daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England. Blanche entered the world with more royal blood than hemoglobin. By the time she could walk, her family was already plotting which relative she'd marry. The winner, Louis VIII of France, her cousin. Not just the third cousin twice removed at Christmas. More like we share grandparents. Should we still do this? But of course, this was medieval royalty, where if your intended partner didn't share a family tree branch with you, it was considered bad diplomacy. At age 12, Blanche sailed to France to marry Louis, whose father, King Philip II, allegedly said she is small, but she will grow charming. They were married in 1200, launching Blanche into a life of dynastic chess, religious fervor, and politely ignoring the fact that most of her husband's ancestors were also hers. Blanche wasn't just a ceremonial figure. When Louis became king, she became queen consort, and after his death, she became the real power behind the throne. As regent for her young son, Louis IX, later St. Louis, she ruled France like a woman who knew exactly how unstable her extended family could be. She organized crusades, crushed rebellions, and managed to keep the kingdom intact, all while navigating barons who doubted her because she was both a woman and slightly more Castilian than they preferred. She answered with diplomacy, force, and occasionally house arrest. Genetically, Blanche represented centuries of consolidation, English, Castilian, French, all smushed together into one determined little queen if DNA had a warning light. Hers would have been blinking furiously. She was pious, fiercely protective of her children, and absolutely not to be underestimated. Louis IX later became St. But Blanche was the one who kept him alive long enough to earn the title. Anne of Bohemia and Hungary was born in 1503, which in Habsburg terms meant she was born with half a crown and half a family reunion in her veins. Her parents were Vladislaus II of Hungary, and Bohemia and Anne of Foix-Condel. And while that's second and may sound like a breath of genetic fresh air, don't be fooled. This was still very much an arranged tangle of royal repeat relations, and grew up knowing she would eventually be married off like a particularly valuable diplomatic briefcase. And sure enough, in 1521, at the ripe old age of 18, she was married to her double first cousin, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, who would later become Ferdinand, the first Holy Roman Emperor. That's right, double first cousin, meaning they shared both sets of grandparents. Basically a mirror match. In modern terms, marrying your double first cousin would raise some eyebrows. In the Habsburg world, it raised dynastic stability and also possibly the rate of birth defects. Priorities, right? Despite the genetic risks. The marriage was politically golden. It united the Habsburgs with the crowns of Hungary and Bohemia. They also produced 15 children. Yes, 15. Because if you're going to consolidate royal bloodlines, why not do it thoroughly? Anne herself was described as pious, kind, and dutiful, which is another way of saying she didn't complain while being used as a glue in a massive European political jigsaw puzzle. She accompanied Ferdinand on his various imperial campaigns and held court in multiple locations, depending on which part of Europe needed a reminder that the Habsburgs were still in charge and still very much into family weddings. Sadly, and died young in 1547, likely worn out from a lifetime of childbirth, statecraft, and pretending her family wasn't aggressively in love with itself. She didn't live to see Ferdinand crowned Holy Roman Emperor, but through her, the Habsburgs had successfully gobbled up Central Europe like it was on clearance. Anne of Bohemia and Hungary's life was a case study in elite inbreeding, a woman born to a dynasty that prioritized borders over biology, stability over sanity, and somehow still ended up producing half the emperors in Europe. Joanna of Naples, also known as Joanna I, ruled from the mid-14th century, a time when marrying your cousin wasn't just fashionable. It was practically a survival strategy for the nobility. Born in 1326 to Charles, Duke of Calabria and Maria Valois, Joanna entered the world already triple-stamped with royal legitimacy and at least 2 layers of cousin marriage residue. Her family tree was a Mediterranean spaghetti bowl on one side, the French House of Valois, on the other the Angevins of Naples. Her uncles were kings. Her cousins were kings. And her marriage prospects were inevitably also kings and cousins. Joanna's first husband was Andrew of Hungary, her cousin naturally. The marriage was an awkward political pairing arranged by the Pope, which is rarely the recipe for a happy union. Andrew was reportedly boorish, unpopular, and about as well liked in Naples as plague rats. Joanna wasn't thrilled. The Neapolitan nobles weren't thrilled, and soon after Andrew was crowned co-ruler. He was murdered, probably strangled with a curtain cord, probably with Joanna's awareness, if not blessing. Let's call it mutual incompatibility. She went on to marry 3 more times to Louis of Taranto, her cousin, James IV of Majorca, also a cousin, and Otto of Brunswick-Grubenhagen, a minor noble with surprisingly little blood relation. Scandalous. If marrying into your own family was an Olympic event, Joanna meddled 4 times. Politically, Joanna was a powerhouse. She ruled Naples in her own right, stood up to the papacy, and supported reforms in a deeply corrupt kingdom. She was even excommunicated at one point for backing the wrong pope during the Western Schism. You know you're doing medieval politics, right, when both your relatives and the Vatican want you dead. She was eventually overthrown by Charles of Durazzo. Yet another relative who invaded Naples, imprisoned her and had her smothered to death with a pillow, which, given her track record with husbands and family, might have seemed oddly familiar. Joanna of Naples ruled boldly as a males, dominated the world, married her way through multiple family branches, and died in the arms of someone who probably shared her great-grandmother. Born in 1566, Isabella Clara Eugenia was the daughter of Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth of Valois, a marriage between close cousins, because at this point the Habsburgs were less a family and more a controlled genetic experiment with a crown budget. From the moment she could hold a quill, Isabella was being groomed to rule, which in Habsburg terms meant learning diplomacy, religion, and how to politely ignore that half your uncles were also technically your cousins. Her father, Philip II, was incredibly fond of her. This may be because she was intelligent and poised, or simply because she didn't try to rebel or marry outside the family. She was considered a strong candidate to inherit the entire Spanish Empire. But the pesky issue of male preference meant that her future would hinge on marriage naturally to another Habsburg. She was eventually married to Archduke Albert of Austria, who was also her cousin. If that surprised you, welcome to your first day learning about European royalty. Together they were appointed co-sovereigns of the Spanish Netherlands, a lovely way of saying you get to govern a politically volatile region and deal with endless revolts while reporting to Madrid. Despite the challenge, Isabella rose to the occasion. She ruled with intelligence, religious zeal, and the calm focus of someone who had memorized every papal encyclical ever written and still found time to micromanage her courtiers. Her marriage to Albert was reportedly happy, or at least peaceful, possibly because they shared enough DNA to communicate telepathically. When he died in 1621, Isabella continued to rule solo as governor. On behalf of the Spanish crown, she took religious vows and dressed as a nun, which didn't slow her down one bit. She oversaw peace treaties, kept the provinces semi-loyal, and even maintained a working post office. Yes, the Habsburgs trusted her to handle war, rebellion, and logistics. That's practically sainthood. Isabella died in 1633, leaving behind a reputation as one of the most competent rulers of her day. Her reign was a rare moment where Habsburg inbreeding produced not just twitchy chins and erratic rulers, but actual competence. Mary of Burgundy was born in 1457, the only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and Isabella of Bourbon. Her inheritance? A massive chunk of European land, a family line that prided itself on noble marriages with familiar surnames, and the expectation that she'd marry another noble with equally recycled DNA. Her father, Charles the Bold, died in battle when Mary was just 19, leaving her suddenly in charge of the richest and most politically unstable duchy in Europe. Everyone wanted a piece of Burgundy. The French, the Habsburgs, the neighbors, the cousins, especially the cousins. To stabilize things, Mary married Maximilian of Austria, future Holy Roman Emperor, and naturally, her second cousin once removed a solid match by Habsburg standards, where the dating pool was basically just the family swimming in circles. The marriage was politically brilliant. Maximilian got access to the Burgundian territories, and Mary got an energetic husband who knew how to swing a sword and sign a treaty, often in the same afternoon. Despite being a power match, it was also reportedly affectionate, which is downright scandalous by arranged marriage standards. But her reign was short and dramatic. She was constantly pressured by French ambitions, rebellious Flemish cities, and courtiers who thought a woman shouldn't be allowed to rule unless she was sewing something at the same time. Mary pushed back, signing the great privilege to grant more rights to her subjects, asserting her authority alongside her husband, and generally doing the medieval equivalent of running a Fortune 500 company with a baby on one hip. Then, in 1482, disaster struck while out hunting. Because aristocrats often like to flirt with fatal injuries for sport, Mary fell off her horse, broke her back, and died at just 25. It was sudden, tragic, and the kind of ending that left Maximilian wearing black and Europe scrambling to claim custody of their children. Her death was a turning point. Burgundy, once an independent powerhouse, got folded into the Habsburg Empire through her son, Philip the Handsome. Yes, that Philip, the one who married Joanna the Mad and passed his jawline to half of Europe. Maria Theresa of Austria was born in 1717, the only surviving child of Emperor Charles VI. Her birth was met with a royal shrug, since she wasn't a son. But Charles, ever the optimist, or perhaps just blind to European politics, issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a fancy imperial document that basically said, yes, I know she's a woman, but she still gets the empire. Okay, spoiler alert. Europe was not okay with that. When Charles VI died in 1740, Maria Theresa inherited the sprawling Habsburg dominions and a diplomatic mess. Nearly every European power challenged her right to rule. Why? Because she had the audacity to be a woman with a crown who hadn't married a first cousin yet. Actually, scratch that. She had Maria Theresa marry Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who was technically her distant cousin. Because, of course, their union produced 16 children, including future emperors, queens, and Marie Antoinette. Yes, they let them eat cake. With that many offspring, Maria Theresa didn't just pass on the crown. She passed on all the chromosomes. But make no mistake, this was no pampered monarch hiding behind velvet curtains. Maria Theresa was one of the most effective rulers of her era. She reformed the military, overhauled taxation, centralized bureaucracy, and modernized education, all while pregnant roughly every other year. It's the kind of multitasking that makes even modern supermoms look like part-timers. And yet, she was still a Habsburg, which meant a healthy level of micromanaging, strict Catholicism, and a reflexive preference for marrying her children into the same handful of families over and over again. The result? An even more tightly wound web of Habsburg cousins now spread across all of Europe like an aggressively bred royal ivy. She ruled until her death in 1780, having outlived her husband, survived multiple wars, and ensured that the Habsburg name stayed plastered across the continent for another generation or 5. Her son Joseph, or Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, inherited the empire, and her genetic legacy continued marching stubbornly into the Enlightenment. Born in 1384, Yolanda of Aragon was royalty from cradle to crypt, the daughter of King John I of Aragon and Violent of Bar. In other words, she had more noble surnames than most people had teeth, and naturally her family tree was less tree and more repeated root system, where half your relatives doubled as potential in-laws. Yolanda's upbringing was as regal as it gets. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and by medieval standards, dangerously opinionated. This made her both a valuable dynastic prize and a nightmare for anyone expecting a quiet queen. Her marriage. Louis II of Anjou, French prince, and yes, her cousin, because nothing says true love like mutually shared great-grandparents. As Duchess of Anjou and Queen Consort of Naples, though only on paper, Yolanda was never content to sit still and embroider coats of arms. She was the behind-the-scenes architect of alliances, the financier of armies, and fun fact, one of the few royals who actually managed to support Joan of Arc and survive the politics afterward. While her husband gallivanted about claiming thrones he couldn't really hold, Yolanda ran things. She raised armies, negotiated treaties, managed estates, and acted as the true power in Anjou. Her children were married off to other royals, again often cousins, and she personally made sure they were equipped with both political advantages and just enough Habsburg DNA to be considered legitimate. Her son, René of Anjou, became known as the Good, possibly because he inherited his mother's brains and only some of her family's chromosomes. Her daughter Marie married Charles VII of France, giving Yolanda influence over the French throne, and more importantly, access to manipulate Joan of Arc's military campaigns without ever lifting a sword. Yolanda wasn't just another stitched-in name on a royal tapestry. She was one of the few medieval women who wielded power without officially holding a throne. Behind every weak king and ambitious general stood Yolanda, occasionally rolling her eyes and correcting the map. She died in 1442, having outlived enemies, husbands, and the worst of the 100 Years' War. She was inbred, yes, but also incisive, calculating, and every bit as influential as the kings she quietly outplayed. Margaret of York was born in 1446 to Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, two people so noble they could barely enter a room without tripping over their own heraldry. As the sister of Edward IV, Richard III, and roughly half the War of the Roses, Margaret's DNA was already programmed for intrigue, bold decisions, and close proximity courtship. So naturally, she married Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a man known for his ambition, terrifying military obsession, and crucially, for being yet another cousin in the pan-European Jean-Louis. Their union in 1468 was less about romance and more about making France nervous. Margaret brought English prestige and Charles brought, well, a remarkably pointy beard and unrelenting stubbornness. Despite the political matchmaking, their marriage was reportedly respectful, and even, dare we say, functional. Margaret fit in surprisingly well at the Burgundian court, which was less dusty, medieval, and more pre-Renaissance Instagram influence, full of silks, tapestries, miniature dogs, and a dangerous obsession with embroidery. Her intelligence and diplomatic skills quickly earned her the nickname the Great Lady of the Netherlands. She played hostess to dignitaries, managed court finances, and even handled correspondence when Charles was out doing Charles things, usually starting wars he couldn't finish. After he died, predictably in battle, Margaret didn't pack up her gowns and retire. No, she doubled down. She became regent and protector of her stepdaughter, Mary of Burgundy, and advisor to her stepson-in-law, Maximilian of Austria. And yes, that's the Maximilian who married Mary and passed the Habsburg name into even more European branches, like a particularly smug virus. Margaret didn't have children of her own, but her influence on dynastic politics was undeniable. She helped raise Philip the Handsome, the guy who married Joanna the Mad, and ultimately gave the world Charles V. So if you're wondering where that dynasty streak of self-important sheen-heavy ambition started, Margaret helped raise it. She died in 1503, outliving her brothers, most of her enemies, and the fading golden age of Burgundy. She may not have added another strand to the inbred family knot, but rest assured she tied it tighter with impeccable etiquette and just enough royal smugness to make it last. Catherine de' Medici was born in 1519 into the powerful, but somewhat scandal-prone Medici family of Florence. Technically not born inbred by Habsburg standards, meaning she had at least a few non-cousins in her ancestry, Catherine soon made up for lost dynastic entanglement. By marrying into the French royal family and producing a small army of genetically familiar monarchs. Her husband was Henry II of France, not her cousin by blood, but definitely a close match politically. Their marriage was strategic. Italy meets France, money meets military power, and Medici ambition meets Bourbon drama. Catherine, for her part, adapted quickly. She arrived in France with no real influence, a suspicious accent, and an awkward third wheel named Diane de Poitiers, her husband's very public mistress. Undeterred, Catherine spent a decade quietly building alliances, learning court intrigue, and collecting children. 10 to be exact. And yes, most of them would go on to marry cousins, because while Catherine wasn't born a Habsburg, she certainly learned to parent like one. When Henry died from a jousting accident, because nothing screams fragile masculinity like taking a splinter to the eye for sport, Catherine became Queen Mother and suddenly the most powerful woman in France. Her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, all took turns wearing the crown, and Catherine took turns ruling behind each of them. She was deeply Catholic but politically flexible, which in 16th century France meant occasionally funding Protestant weddings and occasionally arranging for the mass murder of Protestants in said weddings. Cophisti, Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Cough. Her reputation took a hit after that one. Even for a woman who married her daughters into three major European dynasties, that was considered excessive. Catherine was blamed for nearly everything the wars of religion. The court's decadence, the suspicious poisoning rate at state dinners. But she was also a patron of the arts, a brilliant strategist, and somehow managed to keep the Valois dynasty stumbling forward despite constant wars, rebellious nobles, and family dinners that probably required food tasters and a lot of wine. She died in 1589, politically spent but still plotting her legacy, a generation of royals who looked suspiciously similar, and ruled with a blend of charm, Catholic guilt, and aggressive cousin hugging. In ancient Greece, falling asleep wasn't just about getting rest. It was a sacred act, a bridge to the divine. And nowhere was this more literal than in the Asclepia, dream temples dedicated to the healing god Asclepius. These weren't cozy inns or rustic shrines. They were sprawling spiritual complexes, where the sick, the weary, and the hopeful came not just for treatment, but for transformation. To prepare for sleep in these sanctuaries, you didn't just climb into bed. First came ritual purification. Pilgrims had to fast for days, bathe in sacred springs, offer animal sacrifices, and often abstain from sex or even certain thoughts. The goal was to cleanse both body and spirit before attempting incubation. A spiritual sleep where healing visions might appear. Inside the abaton, a dark, enclosed chamber, supplicants would finally lie down on stone slabs or animal skins. Torches flickered on the walls. Priests whispered prayers and burned incense. Sleep here was an intentional descent into another realm. Dreams were not random or meaningless. They were believed to be direct messages from Asclepius himself, offering symbolic or occasionally very literal guidance for healing. One might dream of snakes slithering over their body, which oddly enough was a good sign. Snakes were sacred to Asclepius, representing rejuvenation and divine intervention. In fact, non-venomous snakes were often allowed to roam the temple grounds, especially the sleeping chambers. Yes, people knowingly fell asleep surrounded by snakes, and considered it a divine honor. In the morning, the temple priests, many of whom acted more like dream analysts than doctors, would help interpret the visions. Sometimes they prescribed herbal remedies or changes in diet. Other times the dream itself was the cure, believed to have realigned the soul or spirit. The Greek dream temples show us that sleep for ancient people wasn't just a biological necessity. It was a mystical voyage, a conversation with the gods. And if you were lucky, that midnight whisper from the divine might not just mend your body, it might change your fate. In ancient Egypt, sleep wasn't merely the absence of waking. It was a miniature death, a time when the soul or bar left the body and wandered through spiritual realms. To guide that journey and protect the dreamer from malevolent forces, the Egyptians developed sleep rituals that were part mysticism, part medicine, and entirely woven into their cosmic worldview. Before going to bed, many Egyptians, especially the wealthy or priestly class, followed elaborate nighttime routines. Incense played a central role. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just exotic aromas, they were sacred tools. Burning these resins was thought to cleanse the air of demons, invoke the favor of the gods, and calm the mind. The smoke itself symbolized the rising of prayers to the heavens, wrapping the sleeper in divine protection. Then came chanting or prayer recitations, often spoken aloud by priests or whispered privately by individuals. These spells weren't just soothing bedtime mantras, they were active spiritual defenses, invoking deities like Thoth, the god of wisdom and dreams, or bears. The squat lion faced dwarf god who warded off nightmares and evil spirits. Images of Best were frequently carved onto headboards or painted on bedroom walls. His grotesque features were meant to scare off anything lurking in the shadows. The bedroom itself was prepared as a sacred space. Beds were often raised and made of woven reeds or wood, and some even included built-in amulets or protective symbols, special headrests, which look wildly uncomfortable by modern standards, were believed to keep the soul aligned with the stars during sleep. For the Egyptians, orientation mattered. Many aligned their sleeping direction to the rising sun or constellations like Orion associated with Osiris and the afterlife. If one had troubling dreams or wanted divine insight, they might visit a temple, especially those dedicated to Serapis or Imhotep, where dream incubation rituals similar to those in Greece took place. Here, too, sleep was invited through chants, oils, and incense, but always with the intent of receiving guidance from beyond. For ancient Egyptians, preparing for bed wasn't just about comfort. It was a ritual choreography meant to harmonize body, soul, and cosmos. Sleep was dangerous, sacred, and full of possibility. In ancient Babylon, the line between dream and destiny was razor thin. Sleep wasn't simply a passive act. It was a battleground of omens, spirits, and divine messages. Babylonians took their dreams seriously. So seriously, in fact, that entire professions revolved around them. Dream priests known as Shelu were trained interpreters of the nightly visions that came to kings and commoners alike before going to sleep. Babylonians often performed protective rituals to ensure that the right kinds of dreams found them. It was believed that dreams could be sent by gods like Marduk or Ishtar, but also by demons or wandering spirits. To ward off malevolent forces, people wore amulets, placed protective tablets under their beds, and traced magical symbols around their sleeping quarters, a kind of astral security system. Incense made from juniper, cedar wood, and tamarisk was burned at sunset, filling the house with sacred smoke. This wasn't just to scent the air. It was believed to purify the environment and appease the gods. Sleep to the Babylonians wasn't just rest. It was a gateway to divine communication, and the gods preferred a clean entrance. Many Babylonians recited nighttime prayers or incantations to encourage prophetic dreams. These prayers asked for clarity, protection from false visions, and safe passage through the dream world. If someone was hoping for guidance on a decision whether to go to war, plant a crop, or propose marriage, they might sleep in a temple or under the open sky, a practice called dream incubation. The hope was that the gods would send a dream so vivid, so unmistakable, that it would guide the dreamer's actions by morning. And when the dreams came, they were recorded on clay tablets, sometimes accompanied by sketches of their content. Over time, the Babylonians compiled dream dictionaries, massive catalogs of symbols and their interpretations. The dream of a lion might mean victory in battle. Dream of drowning. Expect betrayal. These books were so influential that their structure would later influence Greek and Roman dream analysis. To the Babylonians, dreams weren't psychological. Fluff. They were messages from the divine realm, and every night was a chance to read the god's intentions, provided you performed the right rituals and slept under divine favor. In the ancient Vedic world of early India, sleep was more than a biological necessity. It was a cosmic event. The Vedic text, composed thousands of years ago, describes sleep as a sacred state where the Atman, or soul, returns to the universal spirit Brahman, before being reborn again at dawn. And like any sacred ritual, entering sleep required preparation, discipline, and awareness. One of the most important aspects of ancient Indian sleep culture was breath control, known as pranayama. Practitioners were taught to calm their minds and slow their breathing before bed, not to fall asleep quickly, but to align their breath with the pulse of the universe. This wasn't spiritual fluff. It was considered essential to help the soul travel peacefully during the night. Vedic sages believed that disturbed sleep could lead to mental confusion, spiritual imbalance, or even bad karma, so rituals were carefully followed. Many individuals recited evening mantras, Sanskrit hymns that praised the gods or sought protection during slumber. A popular nighttime chant was the Gayatri Mantra, often whispered while facing the direction of the setting sun. The sleeping space itself was important. It was considered inauspicious to sleep with your head pointed north, as that aligned with the realm of death. This was avoided for similar reasons. The preferred direction was east toward knowledge, or west toward rest. People used natural bedding made of kusa grass, cotton, or animal hides, believing certain materials could influence the soul's dreams. Oils and herbs also played a part in preparing for sleep. Ancient Ayurvedic texts describe the use of warm sesame oil massages before bed, known as Abhyanga. This practice calmed the nervous system, relaxed muscles, and prepared the mind for deeper rest. Herbal infusions made from ashwagandha, brahmi, or tulsi were consumed or burned as incense to promote lucid, insightful dreams. Dreams themselves were seen as reflections of one's inner truth, shaped by karma, desire, and purity. A disturbing dream wasn't just random. It was a signal that the soul was out of balance. In some cases, dream interpretation required consulting a rishi or spiritual teacher. In Vedic India, sleep wasn't an escape, it was a return, a reunion with the eternal self wrapped in breath, mantra, and divine intention. In ancient China, particularly within Taoist traditions, sleep was more than rest. It was an energetic reset, a time when the body rebalanced its internal energies and the spirit journeyed beyond the physical realm. To sleep well wasn't just about being tired, it was about being in harmony with the cosmos. According to Taoist philosophy, the human body was filled with qi, a vital life force, that flowed through channels called meridians. If this flow was disrupted, sleep would suffer. So nighttime rituals were focused on preserving and regulating qi before bed. This involved specific diets, breathing exercises, postures, and even the timing of sleep. You didn't just go to bed, you entered a sacred process of tuning the body with heaven and earth. Taoist monks developed pre-sleep practices like qigong, or slow, mindful movements paired with deep breathing. These were often followed by meditation to calm the shen, or spirit, which was believed to reside in the heart. If the shen was agitated due to emotions, poor diet, or even noisy surroundings, the dreamer might experience nightmares, restless sleep, or even spiritual attacks. Sleep environments were carefully curated. Beds were made of wood or bamboo, materials thought to support good energy flow. Headrests were firm and low, so the body's alignment remained correct and COI circulated freely. Rooms were often sparsely decorated to avoid overstimulation. Cleanliness wasn't just a preference, it was energetic hygiene. The position one slept in also mattered. Lying on the right side was considered best for digestion and dream clarity. Feet and head direction were aligned with geomantic principles, similar to what would later evolve into feng shui. Dreams were seen as journeys of the Hun, the ethereal soul. While the Pyo, the physical soul, remained with the body, the Hun traveled through the spirit world during sleep. If a person awoke feeling depleted or frightened, it was believed their Hun had become lost or attacked. Protective talismans or cinnabar-based charms were sometimes placed under pillows to keep spirits safe. Taoists didn't view dreams as mere psychology. They were diagnostic tools, spiritual maps of energy and karma. Sleep, when done properly, was a form of internal alchemy, a practice of nurturing immortality one night at a time. Long before contact with Europeans, many indigenous American tribes regarded sleep and dreams as gateways to spiritual guidance, ancestral wisdom, and personal transformation. Among the Lakota, Navajo, Hopi, and other nations, dreams were not merely personal experiences. They were communal and cosmic messages that had the power to shape a person's destiny or even the fate of the tribe. Night rituals varied from tribe to tribe. A shared belief was that dreams connected the dreamer to the spirit world, often through the intervention of animal guides, ancestors, or deities. To prepare for this connection, individuals engaged in ritual purification. One common method was the sweat lodge, a ceremonial steam bath used to cleanse the body and spirit. Participants would sit in a dome-shaped structure filled with steam from water poured over heated stones, chanting prayers and songs to invite guidance and clarity before sleep. For those seeking deeper visions, especially young men coming of age, tribes practiced the vision quest, a sacred rite involving fasting, isolation, and often sleeping in nature for several nights. The initiate would find a remote location, construct a small space or circle, and sleep there under the stars with no food, water, or company. The goal wasn't just survival, it was to dream. The dream would then be interpreted by tribal elders or shamans and often dictated the seeker's future role: warrior, healer, storyteller, or leader. In everyday life, many indigenous communities believed in dream catchers, a now popular symbol that originated with the Ojibwe people. These intricate webs of sinew and beads were hung above the bed to filter dreams, allowing only good ones to pass through while trapping bad ones until the morning light dissolved them. For children, dream catchers were both protective and symbolic, helping the young navigate a world where dreams could teach, warn, or bless. Elders were often revered as dream keepers, individuals who carried knowledge of symbols and could decipher the meanings hidden within dreams. A vision of a bear might signify strength, while a hawk could indicate clarity or an approaching challenge. Dreams were rarely dismissed. They were discussed around fires woven into myths, and sometimes even used to guide tribal decisions. Among indigenous American traditions, sleep was a sacred dialogue with the unseen, not escape, but awakening. In the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, sleep was tightly interwoven with the divine. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and later Babylonians believed that every dream was a message, and that the night itself was ruled by powerful gods who controlled what the dreamer would see. Sleep wasn't a break from reality. It was an active state of spiritual communication, and preparing for it was almost as important as the dream itself. The Mesopotamians had a rich pantheon of deities associated with the night and dreams. Chief among them was Nanshu, the goddess of social justice, prophecy, and dreams. Her temples welcomed those seeking answers through visions, especially during sacred festivals when the veil between the worlds was believed to be thinner. Worshippers would sleep in the temple precincts in hopes of receiving guidance through what they called dream incubation. To encourage meaningful dreams, people undertook ritual cleansing before sleep. This might include bathing in sacred rivers like the Euphrates or Tigris, anointing the body with perfumed oils, and reciting invocations to Nanshur or Ea, the god of wisdom and magic. Priests often prescribed these rituals as spiritual prescriptions for dreamers seeking help with illness, personal crises, or political decisions. Inside homes, sleep chambers were modest but spiritually fortified. Small clay tablets with inscriptions or protective charms might be placed under pillows or hung near the bed. These included apotropaic spells to ward off night demons like Lamashtu, a fearsome female spirit said to harm women and children in the night. Amulets of the demon slayer Pazuzu were especially popular, positioned to guard sleepers from harm. Dream interpretation was a highly respected profession. Dream readers, or Baru, compiled thick manuals, proto-dream dictionaries based on centuries of observed symbolism. These tablets categorized dreams by content, animals, weather, food, celestial events, and even the emotions felt during the dream. A lion might predict royal favor. A collapsing house might mean impending disaster. The Mesopotamians were early masters of structured intimacy or divination through dreams. Sleep in ancient Mesopotamia was never passive. It was a ritual, a risk, and a revelation. Entering the world of dreams meant entering the jurisdiction of the gods, and you better be prepared with your prayers, your oil, and your protective charms. Among the ancient Celtic peoples, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the oak groves of Gaul, dreams were seen as portals to the otherworld, a mystical plane inhabited by spirits, fae, ancestors, and deities. While the Celts left behind fewer written records than some ancient cultures, oral traditions and later Roman accounts reveal that sleep rituals, especially among the Druids, were rich with symbolism, mystery, and sacred intent. The Druids, spiritual leaders and scholars of Celtic society, believed that during sleep the soul could cross into the other world, a place not of the dead, but of deeper truth. This world existed in parallel with the human realm, and dreams were one of the rare bridges between the two. To access it properly, the body and spirit had to be primed. Night rituals often began with purification using herbs. Mugwort, vervain, and yarrow, plants still associated with dreams and visions today, were burned or placed under pillows to enhance dream clarity. The smoke from these herbs was believed to thin the veil between worlds. Some even brewed them into teas or potions before bed, consumed with whispered prayers to the fair folk or ancestral spirits. Sleep spaces were deliberately chosen for geomantic alignment. Certain hills, stone circles, or sacred groves were believed to be points of energetic convergence, places where dreams could be more potent or the spirits more accessible during certain festivals, especially Samhain. The Celtic New Year, an ancestor celebration. People would sleep in these areas to receive visions from their departed loved ones, or messages from gods like Bridget or the Dagda. Some warriors and leaders reportedly sought prophetic dreams before battle, sleeping alone in caves or forests after intense fasting and chanting. These dreams were believed to carry omens about victory or doom, and were treated with immense seriousness. Symbols from dreams, like animals, colors, or landscapes, were brought to the Philly, Celtic poets and seers who interpreted them in verse. A white stag might mean transformation. A dream of drowning in a forest might point to betrayal. Dreams were woven into Celtic mythology, shaping both personal destinies and communal stories. In the Celtic world, the night wasn't silent. It pulsed with whispers from beyond, carried into the dreams of those brave or pure enough to listen. In ancient Japan, the line between sleep, magic, and the unseen was carefully navigated through a spiritual system known as Onmyoto, the way of yin and yang. Rooted in a blend of Taoist cosmology, Shinto spirituality, and Buddhist elements, Onmyoto offered both elite courtiers and commoners tools to protect the soul during slumber, and to harness the messages embedded in dreams. Central to Onmyoto was the belief that the night was a time when the yin forces, dark, hidden, and often chaotic, were strongest. Sleep makes a person vulnerable to possession by malevolent spirits known as yokai or yurei, and to being influenced by bad kimin, or directional energy. To combat this, practitioners used a variety of pre-sleep rituals that combined spiritual defense and purification. One such ritual involved the placement of a fuda, paper talismans inscribed with sacred spells, on bedroom walls or near sleeping mats. These charms were often blessed by an onmyoji, a specialist trained in astrology, divination, and exorcism. The talismans could repel spirits, seal bad dreams, or channel good fortune. Before bed, it was also common to light incense made from sandalwood or aloes wood. The scent was believed to please guardian spirits and create a purifying barrier. In noble households, ritual chanting or silent recitation of Buddhist sutras might be performed to calm the mind and invite peaceful sleep. Those particularly sensitive to the spirit world would sleep facing auspicious directions, never in, which was associated with death. Children were especially vulnerable, so they were often protected with engraved amulets, or had special dolls placed nearby to absorb or ward off negative energy. These dolls, called hitogata, were thought to take on the burden of the sleeper's spiritual vulnerabilities. Dreams themselves were frequently recorded in private journals or shared with monks and diviners. If someone dreamed of fire, blood, or animals, it could signify impending illness, betrayal, or divine warning. Conversely, dreams of flying, waterfalls, or lotus flowers might herald spiritual growth or blessings. Dreams were messages, but only if you knew how to read them, and only if you survived the night unscathed. For the ancient Japanese, sleep was not to be taken lightly. It was a ritual, a strategy, and a spiritual gauntlet passed through nightly under the silent watch of spirits and stars. Long before the city of Alexandria dominated the Egyptian coastline, there was Heraklion, known to the Egyptians as Thonis. For centuries, it stood as the primary port of entry into Egypt, a thriving center of commerce, religion, and diplomacy, where Greek merchants, Egyptian priests, and foreign emissaries crossed paths in a vibrant cultural melting pot. But by the time historians of the late medieval period were writing their chronicles, Heraklion had seemingly disappeared from history, its location forgotten, its name preserved only in faded texts and half-remembered myths. Many dismissed it as a legend, a sort of Egyptian Atlantis. And yet it was real. Heraklion once sprawled across the Nile Delta, its canals winding past massive stone temples and marketplaces. Monumental statues of gods like Amunjareb and Horus towered above the harbors. Ships from Greece, Phoenicia, and beyond docked there to pay taxes and seek permission to enter inland Egypt. Its customs house was one of the most important in the ancient world. It was also a religious capital, a place where pharaohs would perform ceremonial rites to gain legitimacy from the gods before their reigns began. So how does a city like that just vanish? Sometime between the 2nd and 8th centuries CE, a series of natural disasters struck the region. Earthquakes, rising sea levels, and a sudden phenomenon called liquefaction, where the soil beneath the city essentially turned to jelly, caused entire sections of Heraklion to collapse into the Mediterranean Sea. Over time, sand and silt buried the ruins, and the currents of the Nile's estuary erased what remained from view. Heraklion was literally wiped off the map. For over 1,000 years, the city remained hidden beneath the waves, whispered about only in fragments by Herodotus and a few Greek scholars. No one truly believed it could be found. Not until the year 2000, when French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio made a shocking discovery off the coast of Abu Qia Bay. There, in the silt-rich seabed, lay a city preserved like a time capsule. Waiting patiently beneath 30 feet of water, colossal statues, shipwrecks, gold coins, and inscribed steels began to surface, revealing that Heraklion had not been lost forever, only sleeping beneath the sea. At its peak, Heraklion was far more than a coastal outpost. It was the beating heart of Egypt's international trade, the first stop for foreign merchants and emissaries, before they could pass further into the Nile's interior. Strategically positioned near the canopic mouth of the Nile, the city functioned as a customs checkpoint and a cultural filter. Everything coming into Egypt by sea had to pass through Heraklion first. Ships laden with olive oil, wine, incense, silver, cedar wood, and luxury textiles arrived from the Aegean and the Levant. In return, Egypt offered its signature exports: papyrus, grain, linen, glassware, and gold. Heraklion was the first place where these exchanges were logged, taxed, and blessed, often under the watchful eyes of priestly officials and divine statues. The Greeks who arrived there were fascinated and often intimidated by what they saw. The temples were immense, carved from solid blocks of stone and flanked by statues over 5 meters tall. One temple in particular stood out, a massive sanctuary dedicated to Ammonius Jerub, the fusion of the Egyptian god Ammonius and a local deity. Pharaohs would come here to receive the divine blessing of their rule, participating in ritual coronations that reinforced their legitimacy in the eyes of both gods and men. And yet Heraklion wasn't just about religion and trade. It was also a cosmopolitan city, where Egyptians, Greeks, Phoenicians, Libyans, and others lived, worked, and mingled. Artifacts recovered from the seabed include inscriptions in both Greek and Egyptian, amulets, jewelry, and even tax records scratched into tablets. These finds reveal a city that thrived not on isolation, but on connection, a city that lived and breathed through its interactions with the wider Mediterranean world. Frank Gaudio's underwater excavations have uncovered over 70 ancient shipwrecks, many of which were used to ferry goods to and from Heraklion's busy docks. Anchors, ceramics, and coins confirm that trade was both extensive and regulated. Temples kept detailed records of taxes collected from incoming cargo, gold for the state, incense for the gods. In short, Heraklion was Egypt's maritime soul, a place where divine authority met international commerce. It stood as the guardian of the Nile, welcoming the world and guarding its secrets until the sea reclaimed them. One of the most astonishing revelations about Heraklion came not from coins or ships, but from the massive temples that still rest beneath the sea. These weren't minor shrines tucked into corners. They were sprawling, monumental structures made of limestone and granite. Dedicated to gods who rule the Nile and the cosmos itself, the crown jewel of the city was the Temple of Ammonius, a massive religious complex that likely served both political and spiritual functions. It was here that pharaohs received divine sanction, performing rituals to confirm their legitimacy. Heraklion wasn't just a customs checkpoint. It was a place of ritual coronation, where Egyptian rulers spiritually tied themselves to the divine order, the concept known as Ma'at. But the real marvel is how much of it still survives. When Frank Gaudio and his team dug beneath the silt-choked waters of Abukir Bay, they discovered colossal statues, many still standing upright. Some measured over 5 meters tall, including a massive statue of the god Hapi, symbol of abundance and the flooding Nile. Others included statues of queens and pharaohs carved with astonishing precision. What's more shocking? Some were found nearly intact, despite being underwater for over 1,000 years. Then there were the steel, giant stone slabs inscribed with hieroglyphs. One particularly important find was the decree of Nectanebo Phi, an official proclamation carved into granite, which listed religious laws and temple privileges. Its survival underwater is a miracle in itself. It offered hard proof that Heracleion wasn't just myth, but a major religious hub backed by the state. Temples in Heracleion were not only religious centers, they also acted as repositories of wealth and knowledge. Offerings from around the Mediterranean poured in gold, alabaster jars, ritual knives, and incense burners. Statues of Osiris, Isis, and Horus lined temple halls, and ceremonial boats were used in sacred processions, some of which were found submerged but astonishingly well preserved. What these temples reveal is clear. Heracleion was a spiritual capital, not just a trade port. The rituals performed here shaped the destiny of kings, blessed the economy, and bridged the world of the living with the realm of the gods, all now eerily silent but preserved in stone beneath the waves. For over 1,000 years, Heracleion was lost, buried beneath layers of sediment, forgotten by maps and dismissed by many as myth. But in the year 2000, the silence of the sea was finally broken. French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio, backed by the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology (IENISM), made a discovery that would stun the world: the sunken remains of a city that defied time. Gaudio had spent years studying ancient texts and scouring the murky waters of Abu Qir Bay, just off the coast of modern-day Alexandria. The region had long been suspected of hiding secrets. Clues were buried in the writings of Herodotus Strabo and Egyptian records, all hinting at a once great city swallowed by the Mediterranean. But until Gaudio's expedition, no one had found physical proof. Using advanced sonar and magnetometry, his team scanned the seafloor, identifying anomalies hidden beneath meters of silt. What emerged wasn't just a scattering of relics, it was a fully submerged city. Whole streets, canals, temples, statues, and shipwrecks lay preserved in the anaerobic depths, protected from erosion by layers of mud and river sediment. The first things recovered were colossal statues, including two imposing 5-meter figures of a Ptolemaic king and queen, believed to represent a ruling couple who had once governed Heracleion. Soon followed a massive stele inscribed in both Egyptian and Greek, confirming the city's identity. The bilingual inscriptions were a historian's dream, tangible proof that Thonis and Heracleion were in fact the same city, known by different names to Egyptians and Greeks. Over the next few years, Gaudio's team uncovered over 70 ancient shipwrecks, thousands of coins, weights, religious artifacts, and ceremonial vessels. What made this discovery extraordinary wasn't just the volume, but the state of preservation, unlike ruins found on land. These artifacts were untouched by looters or weather, frozen in time beneath the silt. Frank Gaudio's rediscovery of Heracleion wasn't just an archaeological achievement, it was a resurrection. The city believed to be legend was now re-emerging piece by piece, offering a stunning glimpse into a world thought lost forever. And perhaps most exciting of all, only a fraction of the city has been excavated. Heracleion still sleeps. Waiting for the next dive, Heracleion's rise was spectacular, but its fall was slow, silent, and devastating. Unlike cities destroyed by fire or war, Heracleion vanished beneath the sea in a gradual, almost ghostly decline. There was no single day of doom. Instead, the city was lost through a series of natural disasters that unfolded over centuries. The kind of events too quiet to make headlines, but powerful enough to erase a civilization. The first culprit was tectonic activity. The Nile Delta sits on a seismically active zone, and Heracleion's foundations were particularly vulnerable. Small but repeated earthquakes may have weakened the soft, waterlogged ground beneath the city, which was built on silt and clay rather than firm bedrock. But it wasn't just the tremors that doomed Heracleion. It was a geological phenomenon known as liquefaction. Liquefaction happens when the ground becomes saturated with water and loses its ability to support weight. Imagine a layer of wet sand suddenly turning to quicksand. That's what happened beneath Heracleion. As earthquakes shook the delta and rising sea levels pushed salt water further inland, the earth literally liquefied and whole sections of the city began to sink. Buildings, temples, even ships pulled downward into the mud. Over time, the city fragmented, canals overflowed, quays collapsed, and temples began to tilt and vanish below the surface. The bustling port slowly became unusable, forcing trade to shift westward toward Alexandria, which rose in prominence. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, Heracleon's importance was waning by the 8th century CE. It had almost completely disappeared beneath the waters of the Mediterranean. What's chilling is how little anyone did to stop it, because no one could. Nature moved slowly, but relentlessly. The people of Heracleon didn't flee in panic. They adapted, rebuilt, and prayed. And then one day, it was simply gone. Boats still sailed over its submerged ruins. Fishermen cast their nets where stone gods once stood. The memory of the city faded until even its name became legend. Today, Heracleon's sinking is a stark reminder. Even the greatest cities can be undone, not by enemies, but by the quiet, steady hand of nature. Heracleon may have vanished beneath the sea, but the artifacts recovered from its ruins paint a vivid picture of what daily life might have looked like in this once thriving Egyptian port. Far from being a purely ceremonial or political center, Heracleon was a lived-in city, bustling with markets, temples, courtyards, and shipyards, a place where people worshipped, traded, argued, and dreamed. The city's layout, partially mapped through underwater surveys, shows a network of canals that run between stone buildings and quays. Boats moved goods and people through the streets, just as carts would have in other cities. Heracleon was often referred to as the Venice of Egypt, though it predates Venice by well over 1,000 years. The architecture blended traditional Egyptian forms, pylons, obelisks, and temple courts with Hellenistic influences brought in by Greek settlers. The people who lived here were a diverse mix: Egyptians, Greeks, Phoenicians, Libyans, and other seafaring merchants. Excavated artifacts include Greek amphorae, Egyptian scarabs, and gold coins stamped with various rulers' faces. This melting pot of cultures meant that multiple languages were spoken, multiple gods were worshipped, and multiple traditions coexisted, often within the same household. Religion was central to everyday life. Morning offerings to deities like Ammonius, Isis, and Osiris were as routine as breakfast. Temples weren't just for ceremonies. They acted as economic engines. Employing artisans, scribes, and priests, they stored wealth, administered law, and even recorded taxes. One stele recovered from the site reveals detailed temple protocols, including the taxation of imported goods, proving that religious life and trade were inseparably linked. Food came from both land and sea. Fish and shellfish were abundant thanks to the Nile Delta's brackish waters. While inland farms supplied grains, figs, and beer, markets near the quays would have been noisy, colorful places filled with spices, textiles, and stories from faraway lands. And, of course, there was entertainment. Statues and inscriptions suggest the presence of music, dance, and festivals, especially those honoring Osiris, which included ritual boat processions and dramatic performances. Heracleon was not just functional, it was alive. In the end, Heracleon wasn't just a port or a holy site, it was a home. Its people lived ordinary lives beneath the shadows of colossal gods, unaware that their world would someday become legend, entombed in water. As Heracleon's fortunes began to decline, a new city was rising just a short sail down the coast, Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. In many ways, Alexandria didn't just succeed Heracleon, it supplanted it, becoming the jewel of the Mediterranean and the new beating heart of Egypt's maritime and intellectual life. But the relationship between the two cities wasn't purely competitive. It was part of a larger transformation in Egypt's political and cultural identity. At the time of Heracleon's prominence, Egypt was still ruled by native dynasties, and the city's importance was rooted in traditional Egyptian religion and its strategic location near the Nile Delta's entry point. Heracleon was where foreign ships were inspected, taxes were collected, and divine rituals legitimized kingship. But when the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers who succeeded Alexander, took power, they shifted focus dramatically toward Greek customs, urban planning, and administration. Alexandria, with its grand library, a massive lighthouse, and sweeping harbors, was built to impress and centralize power. The Ptolemies channeled trade through their new city, bypassing Heracleon in favor of a fresh Hellenistic capital. They imported Greek architecture, philosophy, and governance, and made Alexandria not just a trade hub, but a center of science, art, and politics. But for a time, the two cities coexisted. Religious ceremonies were still held in Heracleion, and temples remained operational. However, the balance was shifting. Administrative control moved to Alexandria, as did the elite classes and international attention. Heracleion slowly became a shadow of its former self, still holy, still respected, but no longer essential. Then came the environmental blows, the liquefaction of the ground, the rising sea levels, and the eventual submergence of Heracleion. As the city disappeared beneath the waves, Alexandria rose untouched, its coastal position more stable and better fortified. It inherited the legacy and the traffic that Heracleion once enjoyed. Today, the ruins of both cities tell two sides of the same story. One lies buried beneath the sea, its stones wrapped in silence. The other still buzzes with life, though much of its ancient grandeur has faded. But without Heracleion, there would be no Alexandria. The old city was the gateway and the foundation upon which Egypt's future was built. When Heracleion slipped beneath the sea, it took with it not just temples and statues, but the everyday belongings and sacred objects that defined life in a great city. And thanks to the oxygen-poor, silt-rich waters of Abukur Bay, many of these items have been preserved in astonishing condition, allowing modern archaeologists to piece together not just what the city looked like, but how its people lived, worked, worshipped, and sailed. Among the most breathtaking discoveries are the colossal statues, some measuring over 5 meters tall. These include representations of Ptolemaic rulers, Egyptian deities like Isis and Hapi, and even monumental sphinxes. Though toppled by time, many were found lying where they fell, surrounded by temple debris, as if the moment of collapse had been frozen in mud. Their expressions, posture, and inscriptions are still visible, testifying to the artistic skill of the city's craftsmen. But it's not just the monumental that survived. Divers have uncovered thousands of smaller artifacts, gold coins, lead weights, ceremonial tools, jewelry, and fragments of pottery. One particularly fascinating find was a cache of bronze ritual vessels, likely used in temple ceremonies, bearing intricate inscriptions and religious iconography. Others include oil lamps, writing tools, and personal adornments, the kind of things someone might have carried in a satchel or kept on a home altar. Heracleion was also a port, and its maritime legacy is undeniable. Over 70 shipwrecks have been identified, many preserved with their cargo still aboard wooden hulls anchors. And nautical tools have helped researchers understand how ancient Egyptians and their foreign visitors navigated trade. Some ships even appear to have sunk while docked, suggesting they went down during the same seismic events that doomed the city. Perhaps most mysterious are the stately and bilingual inscriptions written in both ancient Egyptian and Greek. These texts serve as legal documents, religious edicts, and temple inventories, offering direct testimony from the past. One stele confirmed the city's dual identity as both Thonis and Heracleion, solving a historical mystery that had puzzled scholars for generations. In essence, the sea became Heracleion's accidental museum, a place of ruin, yes, but also of preservation. The artifacts pulled from the depths are not just remnants, they are living whispers from a forgotten world, etched in stone, bronze, and silence. Heracleion may be underwater, but its story is far from buried. In fact, the city's rediscovery has sparked a renaissance in how we understand ancient Egypt's relationship with the sea, with foreign cultures, and with the divine. What was once dismissed as a myth, a name whispered by Herodotus, half believed by scholars, is now a powerful reminder that history still holds secrets waiting to rise from the deep. In many ways, Heracleion challenges the traditional image of Egypt as a desert civilization locked along the Nile. This was a maritime city, cosmopolitan and open to the world. Its culture was not static or insular. It embraced foreign influence while retaining a deeply Egyptian soul. The very existence of bilingual inscriptions and Greco-Egyptian religious fusion shows a society that was adaptive, fluid, and complex. For archaeologists and historians, Heracleion is a gold mine, not just of physical objects, but of context. It helps fill the gaps in our understanding of Egypt's late dynastic and early Hellenistic periods. It shows us what a living port city looked like, how temples functioned as both sacred and bureaucratic centers, and how natural disasters could slowly unmake an empire's gateway. But the city's legacy isn't just academic, it's deeply human. The statues, the coins, the wrecked ships. They tell stories of real people, merchants tallying cargo, priests whispering incantations in temple courtyards, sailors docking in foreign harbors under the eyes of stone gods, mothers praying to Isis for their children's safety. All of that life, preserved underwater, silent for 1,000 years, now speaks again. The discovery of Heraklion has also changed the future of archaeology itself. It's proof that submerged cities aren't fantasy. With the rise of sea levels and shifting climates, modern scientists are now rethinking what might lie beneath other coasts, Carthage, ancient Alexandria, even parts of India and Southeast Asia. Heraklion has become a blueprint for uncovering the past in the most unexpected places today. Its treasures are displayed in museums. Its story is told in documentaries and books, but the city still sleeps beneath the waves, mostly unexcavated, vast and waiting. Heraklion is no longer lost, but it remains a mystery, a ghost city between worlds, whispering across time from a sunken age of gods, trade, and vanished empires. Long before modern dentistry and fluoride toothpaste, ancient humans already understood a painful truth. Toothaches suck, and they didn't just suffer through them, they actually tried to treat them. In fact, some of the earliest evidence of dental care goes back nearly 9,000 years, showing that early humans were far more medically inventive than we tend to assume in the Murghar region of present-day Pakistan. Archaeologists uncovered human remains dating back to around 7000 BCE. What they found stunned the scientific community. Several skulls with teeth that had been drilled using flint tools. These weren't accidental marks or signs of trauma. They were precise, intentional holes carefully bored into molars. The teeth belonged to adult individuals, meaning they survived the drilling process. And if that sounds painful, it probably was. There's no evidence of anesthetic, just grit, sharp stones, and a willingness to endure agony in the name of relief. These drills were likely powered by bow strings, using a technique similar to fires starting back and forth spinning that allowed the flint bit to grind into enamel. It's the earliest known form of dentistry, predating Egyptian civilization by millennia. Why did they do it? Theory suggests it was to remove decayed material, relieve pressure from abscesses, or possibly even for ritual reasons. In some cases, the teeth showed signs of bitumen or resin, which might have been used to seal the cavity afterward, a very crude form of filling. This wasn't an isolated case. In other prehistoric cultures, teeth were filed, pulled, and even stained. Among some African and Indonesian groups, tooth modification was common, not always for medical reasons, but as a form of social identity or spiritual protection. Still, the fact remains. Humans understood the importance of their teeth and weren't afraid to go at what when decay set in. Even in these early eras, dental problems were more than just annoying. They could be deadly. An untreated abscess could lead to infection, fever, and even death, which explains why, in a world without antibiotics, drilling out the rot, no matter how crude the method, may have saved lives. So while they lacked porcelain crowns and Novocaine, prehistoric people weren't clueless. They faced dental pain with stone tools, raw courage, and shocking precision, setting the stage for everything that came next. When it comes to ancient medicine, Egypt often steals the spotlight, and dentistry was no exception. The Egyptians didn't just acknowledge tooth problems. They created an entire medical field around it. In fact, the world's first known dentist was an Egyptian named Azira, who lived around 2600 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser. His tomb bears the title chief of dentists and physicians, suggesting that dental care was already a respected profession in the Old Kingdom. But if you're picturing a calm clinic with copper tools and smiling patients, think again. Egyptian dentistry was an intense blend of practical techniques and magical incantations. The famous Ebers Papyrus, a 3,500-year-old medical text, includes remedies for toothaches, infections, and gum disease. Some treatments involve chewed herbs and honey, both of which have antimicrobial properties. Others, however, involve placing a dead mouse on the aching tooth and reciting spells to drive away evil spirits. Not exactly ADA approved. Egyptians also understood the concept of oral hygiene. They used twig toothbrushes, chewed on aromatic sticks to freshen breath, and even made rudimentary toothpaste from crushed eggshells, ox hooves, pumice, and myrrh. It was gritty, abrasive, and not particularly minty, but it worked. In terms of real procedures, evidence from excavated mummies shows attempts at dental surgery. Some skulls show drilled molars, similar to those in prehistoric Pakistan, while others have abscesses that appear to have been drained. There are also signs of crude splints used to stabilize loose teeth. Still, most Egyptians likely suffered through dental problems without major intervention. Their diet, filled with stone-ground bread, introduced plenty of sand and grit into their mouths, which wore teeth down prematurely and caused fractures. Interestingly, archaeologists have found gold wires and metal bands in a few skulls, possibly the earliest examples of dental bridges or stabilization devices. Whether they were used in life or added posthumously is debated, but they prove one thing. Egyptians were thinking creatively about how to preserve the structure of the mouth. In essence, ancient Egyptian dentistry was part science, part superstition. They understood infection, practiced hygiene, and experimented with surgical tools, all while invoking gods like Sekhmet and Thoth for help. They may not have had anesthetic, but they had ambition, and that made all the difference. While the Egyptians were mixing myrrh and ox hooves into gritty toothpaste, the Etruscans of ancient Italy were pioneering something far more glamorous: dental prosthetics. Long before the Romans dominated the Mediterranean, these highly skilled artisans were crafting what could be considered the first dental bridges, elegant, functional solutions to missing teeth. That would influence dentistry for centuries. Dating back to around 700 BCE, Etruscan burial sites have revealed skulls fitted with gold bands and wire ligatures holding replacement teeth in place. These weren't just functional fixes, they were status symbols. In many cases, the replacement teeth were not artificial at all. They were real human or animal teeth, sometimes from oxen, fitted neatly alongside the living teeth using loops of fine gold. It was delicate, precise, and quite possibly painful. But it worked. The Etruscans were known for their metallurgical skill, and that extended to dentistry. The gold bands used in their bridges were soft enough to manipulate, yet strong enough to hold teeth securely in place. These are not quick fixes for commoners. Rather, they were custom dental work for Italy, likely performed by skilled metalworkers or physicians associated with religious or noble households. What's remarkable is how aesthetic their dental solutions were. These bridges weren't just functional, they were crafted to restore facial symmetry and preserve appearance. The Etruscans understood long before modern cosmetic dentistry that missing teeth altered not just chewing, but the entire shape of the face. In a society where appearance and status were deeply intertwined, this mattered a great deal. There's no direct evidence that they performed extractions or surgeries, but the presence of dental appliances suggests that oral health was actively managed, and not purely for medical reasons. Like their elaborate tombs and intricate jewelry, Etruscan dental work reveals a people deeply invested in presentation, legacy, and dignity, even in death. Some of these dental bridges remain in place after burial, suggesting they were worn in life and carried into the afterlife, a sign of how intimately dental care was tied to identity. In a world without dentures or implants, the Etruscans' gold-bound bridges were a mark of innovation and elegance, a gleaming smile from a civilization ahead of its time. By the time the Roman Empire rose to power, dentistry had evolved into a mix of practical treatments, surgical experimentation, and questionable cosmetics. The Romans didn't just inherit medical knowledge from the Etruscans and Greeks. They expanded it, codified it, and added their own uniquely Roman flair. Think of it as ancient dental care with a touch of militarized efficiency and vinegar rinse. One of the most famous Roman medical writers, Aulus Cornelius Celsus, described dental procedures in his medical Encyclopedia de Medicina. He noted techniques for extracting teeth, treating toothaches, and even cleaning the mouth with abrasive powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, and charcoal. Some recipes included urine, which sound horrifying today, but actually provided a natural source of ammonia, a potent cleaning agent. Yes, Romans used urine as mouthwash bottled and imported from provinces like Portugal and Gaul. It was prized for its whitening effect on teeth. Elite Romans seeking bright smiles may have suffered through daily gargles of fermented ammonia, followed by a rinse of wine or vinegar to freshen the breath. Vanity, it seems, can override disgust. Beyond that, Roman physicians used forceps, scalpels, and dental elevators for extractions and oral surgeries. Metal tools have been found in excavation sites alongside surgical kits, showing that dentistry, while painful, was not uncommon. Soldiers in particular received treatment for broken or abscessed teeth, as oral health was considered vital to combat readiness. The wealthy, on the other hand, had access to early prosthetics inspired by Etruscan designs. These included bridges secured with gold wire and replacement teeth made from ivory or bone. Like their predecessors, Romans saw teeth as status symbols. A full white smile was associated with beauty, power, and good breeding, especially in the public arenas of the Forum or the baths. Even the philosopher Pliny the Elder chimed in, recommending remedies like burnt mouse ash for toothaches or chewing mint for bad breath. His works, while eccentric, reflect how deeply oral health was woven into everyday Roman life in the end. Roman dentistry was as advanced as it was brutal. Painful, certainly. Effective, occasionally. But for an empire obsessed with control, hygiene, and appearance, taking care of one's teeth was a Roman duty, no matter how strange the methods. While ancient Mediterranean civilizations were using gold wire and crushed bones to clean their teeth, the Maya of Mesoamerica were turning dentistry into a literal art form for the Maya. Dental modification wasn't just about health, it was about status, identity, and spiritual symbolism. They didn't just fix teeth, they adorned them, carved them, and embedded them with precious stones, all without modern anesthesia. Archaeological findings from sites in present-day Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras have revealed skulls with intricate dental work dating back over 1,000 years. Many Mayan elites had inlays of jade, turquoise, hematite, or obsidian fitted into their front teeth, not after death, but while they were alive. The inlays were carefully set into small, perfectly drilled holes in the enamel, using primitive rotary tools tipped with obsidian or other sharp stones. It's believed they used water, powdered quartz, or even plant resins as lubricants and adhesives to keep the gems in place. The precision of these modifications is astounding. The drilled holes are so symmetrical and clean that researchers believe the Maya had a deep understanding of dental anatomy, even if they didn't frame it in medical terms. And remarkably, there's minimal evidence of nerve damage or infection, suggesting these procedures were not only common, but successfully executed. But why did they do it? The answer lies in cultural meaning. For the Maya, the mouth was a powerful symbol, the place where breath and speech emerged, both considered sacred. Modifying teeth was a way to honor the gods, signal elite status, or align oneself with cosmic forces. Jade, for example, was associated with life, fertility, and divine favor. A ruler with jade-inlaid teeth wasn't just showing off, they were embodying sacred authority. The Maya also practiced tooth filing, reshaping canines and incisors into points, not unlike vampire fangs or symbolic glyphs. In some cases, the designs mimicked animal forms, likely invoking spiritual protection or transformation. And while some dental work served ceremonial purposes, evidence suggests others were functional repairs, like filled cavities or drilled abscesses. So the Maya weren't just performing ritual art, they were also treating real dental problems. Centuries before European dentistry had caught up. To the Maya, dentistry was a fusion of medicine, magic, and aesthetics, a worldview drilled into every glittering smile. In ancient China, dentistry wasn't a separate science. It was deeply integrated into the broader philosophy of traditional Chinese medicine, TCM. Rather than isolating the mouth as a separate unit, Chinese physicians believed that oral health reflected the health of the entire body. A sore tooth wasn't just a dental issue, it was a sign of internal imbalance in the organs, particularly the stomach and kidneys. And while they didn't use drills or bridges like other civilizations, the Chinese developed a sophisticated system of preventive and herbal dentistry that spanned centuries as early as 3000 BCE. Writings and texts like the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, made mention of dental issues. Ancient practitioners mapped meridians, energy channels that connected the teeth to specific organs. For example, pain in a lower molar might point to issues in the bladder or stomach. Rather than attacking the symptom, Chinese medicine sought to restore balance through diet, acupuncture, and herbal treatments to keep teeth healthy. Daily oral hygiene was emphasized. People chewed fragrant twigs from aromatic trees like willow and miswak to clean their teeth, similar to toothbrushes. They also used saltwater rinses, crushed herbs, and even powder bone to scrub away buildup. Tooth powders often included cloves, mint, rhubarb root, cinnamon, and ginseng, all aimed at freshening breath, reducing inflammation, and strengthening gums. Toothaches were treated using acupuncture, specifically targeting points along the jaw, neck, and even hands to relieve pain and stimulate healing. This non-invasive approach was often paired with poultices, mixtures of ground herbs applied directly to the gum or cheek to draw out infection or reduce swelling. Interestingly, ancient Chinese texts also reference tooth regeneration techniques using mineral pastes or spiritual rituals involving dragon bones, fossilized animal bones believed to carry potent life energy. These bones were ground into powders and sometimes mixed with wine or herbs to create a kind of early medicinal paste. There is limited evidence of surgical intervention or tooth extraction in early Chinese civilization, but that may reflect the cultural emphasis on preservation and balance rather than invasive correction. In many ways, their focus on prevention, clean diets, consistent hygiene, and body-wide balance mirrors some of the best practices of modern holistic dentistry. For the ancient Chinese, the path to a healthy mouth began not in the mouth, but in the harmony of the entire body. In ancient India, oral health wasn't treated in isolation. It was considered a vital part of the body's overall balance and energy flow, rooted in the ancient medical system known as Ayurveda. Dating back over 3,000 years, Ayurvedic texts like the Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita contain detailed observations on dental care, tooth diseases, and remedies, some of which are surprisingly aligned with modern understanding. The Ayurvedic approach to dentistry emphasized prevention, purification, and daily rituals. One of the most enduring practices was Dantadavana, or daily tooth cleaning using herbal chewing sticks. These sticks came from specific trees like neem, licorice, or babol, all of which have antibacterial properties. People would chew on one end until it frayed, then use it to brush their teeth. This practice still exists in parts of rural India today, but oral care didn't stop there. Ayurveda also advocated oil pulling, known as kavala or gandusha, where oil, usually sesame or coconut, was swished in the mouth for several minutes. This wasn't just a hygiene ritual. It was believed to pull toxins from the body and strengthen teeth, gums, and jaw. Modern studies have found that oil pulling may actually reduce harmful bacteria and improve gum health, giving ancient wisdom some scientific credibility. Sushruta Samhita, attributed to the surgeon Sushruta around 600 BCE, contains chapters specifically on tooth extraction, jaw fractures, and oral ulcers. Sushruta described surgical instruments for removing damaged teeth and draining abscesses, using iron tools and herbal paste to disinfect the area. He also recommended cauterization, burning the infected area with a heated tool for severe cases of decay or gum disease. Painful, yes, but methodical. Ayurveda classified dental diseases into categories like Danta Harsha, tooth sensitivity, Danta Shakara, Tatar buildup, and Danta Avesta gum inflammation. Treatments were tailored according to a person's dasha, their body constitution, Vata, Pitta, or Kapha, and could involve dietary changes, herbal rinses, and even meditation to reduce stress-related grinding or jaw tension. For the ancient Indians, the mouth was a sacred gateway, a channel through which speech, nourishment, and breath all passed. To keep it clean, healthy, and balanced was not just a health decision, it was a spiritual obligation. In Ayurveda, dentistry wasn't just a branch of medicine, it was a daily act of alignment between body, mind, and spirit in the ancient Greek world. Medicine and dentistry were deeply influenced by philosophy, observation, and early anatomy. Unlike some civilizations that saw disease as purely spiritual, the Greeks, especially from the classical period onward, sought rational explanations for pain and decay, including dental issues. And while they didn't have dentists in the modern sense, their physicians practiced surprisingly advanced oral care for their time. Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Aristotle wrote about teeth in medical and anatomical terms. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, described the structure and eruption of teeth, causes of tooth decay, and even methods of extraction. He believed that imbalances in the bodies for humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile could lead to dental disease, especially gum infections. and tooth pain. For the Greeks, diet played a central role in oral health. Physicians warned that soft, sticky, or overly sweet foods could cause decay. Instead, crunchy foods like apples, grains, and legumes were encouraged for scraping residue off teeth. There's also mention of chewing mastic gum, a resin from the mastic tree, to freshen breath and clean the mouth, a practice still popular in the Mediterranean today. When problems did occur, Greek physicians employed treatments that ranged from herbal remedies and poultices to rudimentary surgical procedures. Tooth extractions were done using metal forceps, often without anesthesia. The pain was intense, but sometimes relieved with herbal sedatives like opium poppy, mandrake, or henbane. For abscesses, physicians used lancing techniques to release infection, often followed by salt or wine rinses for disinfection. Aristotle took a particularly detailed interest in teeth, even noting that men and women had different numbers of molars, which turned out to be incorrect but demonstrated his effort to systematize human anatomy. The Greeks also documented rare dental conditions, such as teeth erupting later in life or even congenital toothlessness. Dentistry was not considered a separate field, but part of general medical training. Physicians treated everything from ulcers to fractures, and teeth were just another part of the body to be studied and healed. In essence, ancient Greek dentistry was a fusion of science, observation, and pain tolerance. It wasn't glamorous, but it was grounded in the belief that the body, even its teeth, could be understood, predicted, and corrected through logic and learning. Across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, ancient dentistry evolved not as a single linear science, but as a global tapestry of innovation, ritual, and resilience. From flint drills in prehistoric Pakistan to gold bridges in Etruria, from jade-inlaid Mayan molars to Ayurvedic oil pulling, early societies approached dental care with a mix of bravery, ingenuity, and sheer necessity. Though their tools were primitive and pain management often non-existent, ancient cultures made surprisingly sophisticated advances. They didn't have bacteria theory or x-rays, but they understood that rotting teeth caused suffering, and they did what they could to intervene, whether by drilling out decay, using herbs to numb the pain, or crafting prosthetics to preserve appearance. These early dentists, or healers, priests, and artisans moonlighting as such, laid the foundation of a medical art that would eventually become a modern profession. More striking still is how interdisciplinary ancient dentistry was. It wasn't just medical. It was spiritual, cosmetic, philosophical, and even political. In some cultures, a bright gemstone-studded smile conveyed divine favor or social status. In others, missing or misshapen teeth were tied to personal imbalance or even considered omens from the gods. Oral health, it turns out, was never just about chewing the tools left behind. Obsidian blades, copper probes, gold ligatures, herbal scrolls are fragments of a story that stretches across continents. They prove that ancient people, often thought of as primitive or superstitious, were curious problem solvers. They watched, they experimented, and they passed down what worked, and many of their practices endure. We still floss, rinse, and brush. We use herbal ingredients like clove, mint, and myrrh. Some even continue ancient customs like oil pulling or chewing neem sticks, not because they're nostalgic, but because they work. Modern dentistry, with its implants, lasers, and 3D imaging, may seem worlds apart from stone drills and mouse skull poultices, but the goal remains the same: relieve pain, preserve teeth, and improve lives.